IB Nation, welcome back to another edition of the Irish Breakdown Podcast. It's Wednesday, y'all. That means it is time for the midweek rundown. Got a packed show for you guys today. This is going to be a fun show. At least I'm going to have fun on this show. I hope you all have fun too. Going to cover a lot of different topics today. Going to start off with talking about the Guerby Lambert commitment, break that down, kind of, what I think of that commitment and how it came to be and what he means to this Notre Dame class. Then I'm going to dive into sort of two aspects of the Ohio State matchup. Somebody yesterday sent me some graphic that somebody did comparing the position breakdowns and who had the advantage, and it was kind of silly. I mean, Ohio State with the advantage at quarterback, and it was kind of silly. So I was like, you know what, I'll do one, and I'll try to actually give real analysis on this one and not a homer take and go over, who has the advantage when you compare them in a way that really doesn't impact the game directly, quarterback versus quarterback, running back versus running back. Then I'm going to do a matchup breakdown that's going to dive more into, how the game matches up, how it's going to actually be played. Notre Dame run game versus Ohio State rush defense. Ohio State, rush game versus Notre Dame rush defense. Break that down a little bit. And then at the end, the third section, kind of the fourth section, but I'm putting those two matchup things together. In the third section, I'm going to dive into, take a look at, really the Notre Dame players that have to step up in this game. If Notre Dame is going to win this game, pull off what people believe to be an upset, who are the guys that are going to be really need to kind of bring it on Saturday night? Who are going to have to be the playmakers? Who are going to have to be the guys that really take things to that next level for Notre Dame? And we'll dive into that as well. So it's going to be a lot of fun. Really looking forward to this one. And let's get into it. We'll kick things off today talking about the Guerby Lambert commitment for Notre Dame. This is one that's been a long time coming, but I know a lot of you had a lot of angst. We see it in the chat all the time. What's the latest with Guerby? What's going on with Guerby? Now you don't have to answer that question anymore. Guerby Lambert is now a Notre Dame commit, and he's officially a Notre Dame commit. This was a big one for Notre Dame in a lot of ways. When you look at Guerby Lambert, it's not just that you landed an offensive lineman. You landed a position of need. Tackle was a big position of need for Notre Dame this year. You landed one of the best tackles in the country in Guerby Lambert, which we'll dive into. You also got a kid that, to me, it's a statement win for Joe Rudolph to be able to get into that, which we'll talk about. But, also it impacts Notre Dame's from a ranking standpoint, which I know a lot of you guys – some of you, I should say, put a lot of emphasis on when you look at the rankings. And so it impacted Notre Dame in a big way in that way as well. If you look at the On3 rankings, which theirs are a little weird, they had Notre Dame, I believe, 14th yesterday coming into the day. And then when Guerby committed, it jumped them up to 8th. That was a pretty big jump up the rankings. Rivals, which is much higher on this Notre Dame class than other people, which I think they're in this cycle, for example, they're probably more accurate on most of the kids in the class. It jumped Notre Dame up to 4th in their rankings. And so I have to go back and look at the math again, because I thought it was going to bump them up a little higher, but maybe Florida got a kid yesterday in their class, but I'll have to look at that one here real quick. But Notre Dame goes out there and gets that pickup, which was big for him. And then I believe I haven't looked at 247's rankings. I'll actually look at those right now. I've honestly stopped really paying attention to 247's rankings in this class because they're just so off on so many players. But getting Guerby moved them up to 7th in the rankings, allowed them to leap Tennessee and Oklahoma. I believe and I believe they were 10th coming into the week. Of course, that's the composite team rankings for 247, not actual 247 rankings, because they have Notre Dame a lot lower, as I said, because it's a screwy. They have very screwed up rankings in this cycle as well. But anyway, this gives Notre Dame a nice boost for people who care about such things. For Guerby Lambert on the Irish Breakdown board, Guerby is a 4.5-star player, which means he's a top 50 recruit. He is also top 50 player according to On3, who has him as the number 28 player in the country. He's just outside the top 50 according to Rivals and ESPN. He's a top 65 on both of those. 247 is the only one that doesn't have him as a top 100 player, which shouldn't come as a surprise to people in this process. Guerby is the number 3 ranked player in the offensive class for me right now on the Irish Breakdown board. He is, if you guys have not had a chance to see that today, I did an update on the front page at irishbreakdown.com actually pull it up here real quick, where I broke down the offensive class. Every time that they get a player, I add to it. But here, let me just pull this up here real fast so you guys can get a glimpse of it. So here we go. Let's go present, share screen, and there you go. So this is one of our free content pieces at Irish Breakdown. Get rid of that little pasta thing that's going to make me hungry. So as you can see, that's the ranking of the Notre Dame offensive commits in this class. CJ Carr still in my number 1 spot. Cam Williams is number 2. I have not done regrades for the seniors or for this class up to this point in time. So this is basically what they were based off junior film. And so I will do regrades as we kind of get through this process and let you guys know what I think. So he is the number 3 player right now, but he is my number 1 player on the upside grade. So let me just pull up the upside grade here real fast, and I'll show you guys that one next. This is the ranking for the upside grade. And Guerby has the number 1 upside on the board. Cam Williams is number 2, and CJ Carr is number 3. So my top 4 is really the same, upside and current grade. There's not a lot of difference. There was a lot more last year. The top 4 players are the same. They just move around a little bit. Kedron stays at 4 in both of them. He's close. I've really liked what I've seen from Kedron Young so far this year, but I just need to let the whole season play out and let those things factor in before I really dive into the possibility of bumping his grades up at all. But right now, love Kedron Young. Y'all know that. He's been in that 4 spot. CJ Carr, Cam Williams, Guerby Lambert round out my top 4 from an upside ranking standpoint. And then when you just look at the overall class, those 3 guys are my top 4 in the class period, or top 3 in the class period. The only player that I have in the top 50 as a top 50 national recruit on the Irish Breakdown board on defense is Kingston Viliama-Asa. So he's the only guy that I have rated as a top 150 player. I'm going to pull that up here real quick. I'm going to go pull up Kingston's page. Just give me 1 second. I am pretty sure I have Kingston as a top 50 player. Commit profile. Give me 1 sec. Let me pull that up. So Kingston, I do have him I have him as a top 100 guy. So I don't have Kingston graded out as a top 50 guy. I would assume he's going to be a top 50 guy after I regrade his senior film because he's been much more athletic this year, but I don't regrade senior film until the senior year's over. But just based off, and the reason I can't say it for sure is because my rankings are off of a point system. So every position group has 8 different categories, and then however your points add up, it fits into a range, and that's how I determine, 4-star, 4.5-star, 5-star, and all those type of things. So that's where he'll fit into that one. So right now, Kingston is a top 100 guy. He's just outside the top 50 range. I would assume when I regrade him, he'll be a top 150 guy as well. But it does confirm, as I said, that those 3 kids that I talked about, Cam Williams, CJ Carr, Guerby Lambert, are my top 3 players in this class. And it's really an excellent offensive class. And Notre Dame has really done well the last 3 years. The 22 class had some misses in regard to receiver depth, and you lost some guys down the stretch at receiver. You didn't get you had a chance to maybe get a Drew Aller. You couldn't get that done. You did have a very good running back class, though. Love Jadarian Price. Tobias Merriweather, obviously, is already starting. The tight end class is already making an impact. Holden Stace, Eli Raridan will be back at some point in time, hopefully this year. So your sophomore class is already making a big impact, but you had some misses. Then last year's sophomore class was another jump. You had Kenny Minchie at quarterback. Jeremiah Love's a big-time player running back. Excellent receiving class. 3 of those guys are already making an impact with Jeremiah Love, Jaden Greathouse, and Rico Flores. Talked to somebody, close to the program, was it 2 days ago, about Braylon James, and they're like, look, as long as he's patient, he's going to be fine because they love his talent. They're still very excited about Braylon. Obviously, Cooper Flanagan's already getting in the rotation. Injury has helped that, but Cooper's taking advantage of it. And then, of course, a very, very strong offensive line class last year. Now you're following up with in another year where you get an even higher graded quarterback, a great 1-2 punch at running back in Kedron Young and Aeneas Williams. Losing Isaiah Canyon stings a little bit, but I like Logan Saldate. I have him graded out as a top 250 player. I have Micah Gilbert as a top 150 guy at receiver. And then, of course, I have Cam Williams as a top 50 guy. So another strong year wide receiver. Obviously, Jack Larson's not quite in the same caliber as some of the tight ends they've landed in recent years, but still a good football player, brings a different element to the table. And now that you have Guerby Lambert, it really raises the offensive line grade up. And like Peter Jones, like Anthony Knapp, they're not big time prospects for me. Styles Prescott is one of those low floor, high ceiling guys right now. But you add a guy like Guerby Lambert, who's just an elite talent, and it adds to that. So that's a little bit of the class impact aspect of Guerby Lambert and what he adds to the class. I want to talk a little bit about the backstory and really what he brings to the table for Notre Dame. So when you look at the backstory, this is an interesting one because I know a lot of you have been asking a lot of questions about Guerby over the last several months, and it's a really interesting recruitment. And I had somebody ask me the other day. They said, would Harry Hiestand have landed Guerby Lambert? And I said yes, he would have. And he then asked, well, does that take away from the job that Joe Rudolph did to get Guerby Lambert? And I said, no, not at all. And so here's basically how the process played out. So Guerby was very high on Notre Dame early, as you all know. Notre Dame was his leader. I was told he contemplated committing, a long time ago, but just as we found out in this process, he didn't view the recruiting process maybe the same as a lot of other kids did. Really liked Coach Hiestand, loved the tradition at Notre Dame, and Notre Dame was going to get him when Coach Hiestand was here. Then when Coach Hiestand left, obviously that shook things up a little bit. And there was several weeks before a new offensive line coach was made, and during that time, you had schools like Ohio State, Penn State, Boston College were able to kind of get involved with Guerby and draw his interest. And Penn State made a move on him, but there wasn't a ton of interest that I was told on Guerby's end on Penn State. The school that he liked was Ohio State. Now, if you guys remember, Guerby doesn't really do a lot of visits. And he did make a visit to Ohio State, obviously, which was big. And they made a move on Guerby. And there was a time where Ohio State was Notre Dame's biggest competition, but they were never the leader for Guerby. That was Notre Dame the entire time, because as soon as Joe Rudolph got hired, got into the film, started kind of going through the process of evaluating the board, he obviously got on Guerby very quickly as well. And over time was able to really build up a good relationship with Guerby, who always had interest in Notre Dame. But once Coach Hiestand left, it allowed other schools to pique his interest a little bit. And Coach Rudolph did a really nice job building that relationship. Chad Bowden did a really nice job building a relationship with him. Obviously Coach Parker, Coach Gaduli, but really this comes down to Coach Rudolph really selling his vision for what Guerby could be at Notre Dame. And that was a big part of it. So yes, they would have got him if Coach Hiestand was here, but that doesn't at all take away, in my opinion, the job that Coach Rudolph had to do once Coach Hiestand left. It was almost like you're starting from scratch at that point in time. And he did a really nice job building this relationship up and getting the job done. So you give him credit for getting this one done and getting Guerby in the class. Now, he has not been a silent commit per se, but the reason we weren't stressed about it is because Guerby has been telling Notre Dame for a long time this is what he wanted. Like I said, he just viewed the recruiting process a little different. And then finally was able to get it done and make the decision. And so it's been some fun stories, backstories, and all that. But all of it just comes down to this is a young man that understood what Notre Dame had to offer him, and he's a kid who him and his family very much have interest in making sure he gets a great education. That's why he visited Harvard. Now he's the potential to get into Harvard speaks volumes about the kind of student he is. And at the end of the day, the opportunity to not only play to go get an truly elite education, but also the opportunity to play elite football is what boiled down to for Guerby Lambert. And then of course the relationship with Coach Rudolph played a big part of that. And that's how the backstory went. As far as the class impact goes, just kind of rehashing on that, Notre Dame came into this class. This is more specific to the offensive line class impact. Notre Dame came into this class really with a big need at offensive tackle. The numbers overall on the offensive line weren't all that important. It wasn't so much, hey, you need 5 guys. They had signed 5 guys in 21. They signed 5 guys in 24 or 22, although one of them, Joey Tanona, who's a really good prospect's career ended really early because of an injury that was not football related. Then they signed 5 more in 2023. So you come into the cycle and numbers aren't really a need. You haven't lost anyone from those classes other than Joey Tanona. So you have a lot of talented young players on campus. As you guys look at the Notre Dame depth chart, it's loaded with second-year players. And then, of course, I'm hearing great things about what we've seen already from Charles Jagasaw. The staff is very high on what they see from Sullivan Absher. Sam Pendleton's made an impact. And then there's a lot of people that have already talked about Joe Wadding as a guy that's going to really provide depth early in his career and eventually have a shot to push for a starting lineup. So there's a lot of potential there. But what Notre Dame didn't really have a lot of in the younger classes is a lot of pure tackles. You obviously have Emil Wagner in the 22 class. And then the staff looks at Charles Jagasaw and Sullivan Absher as guys that can play tackle, but they're more kind of right tackles, those power players, the profile in that regard. And then there's always a chance that when you look at this class, that the makeup of the line, there's always a chance that Charles Jagasaw's fastest path to getting on the field could end up being guard at some point in time. And same thing with Sullivan Absher. And there was really just a need for Notre Dame to go out and get a pure tackle and a guy that can play left tackle. Now, the interesting thing is Guerby doesn't play left tackle in high school. He plays right tackle for his high school team. But the tools are all there for him to be a big-time player. And when you look at Guerby, he's 6'7", 6'6", 6'7" is what he's listed as, in freakishly long arms. Some of the I won't say it, what the number is, but because I don't have confirmation of it, but what I have been told about his arm length is just insane. It's a really silly length. And that's a lot where my Ronnie Stanley comparison comes from for him. It's just the exceptional length, the foot quickness. He's a very agile athlete. He's not like a real explosive guy like, wow, what a freaky athlete. But he's a very smooth, nimble athlete, changes direction with ease. He's a guy that gets out of his stance well. He's really explosive off the line, coming downhill in the run game. And as a senior, he's shown the ability to better use his hands, and he's got a nice natural punch, but the length is exceptional. And as a sophomore and junior, he would let guys kind of get into his body like a lot of young offensive linemen do. But this as a senior in his first 2 games, I've played 2 games so far, you're seeing him really use his hands as weapons, and it's really been effective, and it's made him an even better prospect, and very excited about it. But he's got a huge frame, listed at 299, looks bigger than that. He's going to easily be 315, 320. I mean, he's going to be a big boy. And again, it's kind of, I don't like doing the lazy lazy comparisons with Notre Dame commits that you got to always compare him to a Notre Dame player. But honestly, that's the best fit. I mean, I really look around college football the last 10 years, and I don't know that there's a better comparison for him than Ronnie Stanley. 6'6", it's going to be 320. He's nimble. He's got great length. The difference between Guerby and Ronnie Stanley is Guerby projects as a better run blocker than what Ronnie was in college. Ronnie was a really good pass blocker in college. Didn't really become a good run blocker until the NFL. I'm told he's become a good run blocker in the NFL. He wasn't a great run blocker in college. He was good. He wasn't great. And now Guerby obviously is going to have to be a little bit more consistent than Ronnie was. That was always the big frustration with Ronnie. He just was an inconsistent player as well. But when you look at the size, when you look at the length, when you look at the athleticism, when you look at style of play, there's a lot of similarities between Guerby and Ronnie Stanley. And that was the comp that I used. And even though he's a right tackle in high school, he projects as a left tackle at the next level. I mean, the only thing that could keep him from being a left tackle, in my opinion, is if he just can't play left-handed. I mean, every other trait he has is special. I mean, long. And when I talk about height, that's one thing, right? 6'6", 6'7", that's great. But it's the length I'm talking about is the arm length. He's got exceptionally long arms. He's got the feet. He's got the frame. There's nothing he lacks that makes me say, hey, this kid can't be a left tackle at the next level. And that was important. So getting that to the class was a really, really big pickup for Notre Dame. And so I love the pickup. I really do. I mean, it was a bit anticlimactic, because we knew it was going to happen over time. We've known it was going to happen for a while, but look, I'll be honest, the longer it went and he was just wasn't making the public commitment, you start to wonder, like, is there something else going on? And, but he didn't schedule visits to Ohio State or Penn State or any of those schools. So you kind of felt like, yeah, it's going to be fine. And then of course, got the word a few days ago that it was going to happen this week. And so very excited about this. This is a really, really big pickup for Notre Dame. Needed this pickup, right? And so now you look at the offensive class and essentially, guys, they're done. I mean, there's no other quote unquote needs in the offensive class. If there's maybe another receiver that wants to come, if Notre Dame continues to play well, you give him a look. Obviously they're still working on trying to flip Carter Nelson. Don't really see that happening right now. We reached out to them to see if they were coming to the game this weekend. We were told they're going to be I believe at Nebraska this weekend. be at that game, which is obviously where Carter is committed. So I'm not really holding my breath on that being an option for Notre Dame this week. He wants to be at the Nebraska-Louisiana Tech game instead of the Notre Dame-Ohio State game. I think that speaks volumes about his commitment to Nebraska, and good for him. If that's where he wants to be, then I respect that. So right now they're pretty much done, and so now all the emphasis is going to be put on the 25 class. When you look at what's next, even with Guerby, you still have a need for tackles in next year's class. Obviously, Owen Strebig's a big name on the board there that they need to continue to close on. Rowan Burns, and more of an interior guy that's high on the board. Now it's like try to go get a Josh Petty type of kid, one of those really elite athletes. Maddie Augustine's a guy that the Notre Dame staff is very high on. So those are some guys that you continue to look at. Somebody just asked as far as 24 kids. Somebody said about David Andrews. I'm talking about the offensive class. Defensive class is not done. They're still trying to flip a lot of kids. And Davis Andrews is not one of them because Davis Andrews is uncommitted. But I've been saying this for a while, Pete. Pete Weber just respond to you. Davis Andrews is I count as a 26 kid because he's going to go on a 2-year mission. So I know he's a 24 kid. We like where Notre Dame is. He's at with him. He's going to be on campus this weekend. Ryan will have more on that at our Irish Breakdown. But at the same time, this was about offensive class. They're done on the offensive class unless there's a receiver that wants to come. They're still trying to flip multiple defensive linemen. They're obviously still working on Caleb Beasley and some other guys. So defensive staff is still working. Offensive staff right now, the focus is going to be on 2025. And that's pretty much where they're going to be at here moving forward. All right, let's talk about let's dive into this next subject, y'all. So I keep hearing things from the Ohio State side and nationally, and there's these conversations about how Ohio State's roster is just significantly better than Notre Dame's, and it's an interesting take, and I understand where it comes from, but I think a lot of this analysis is I don't want to say lazy. I think it's too focused. It's outdated, is the way that I would look at it, and I think that's going to be something that Notre Dame needs to be able to show this weekend is that, hey, we don't have an inferior roster to you, and that's going to be the big key. But when you look at it, even if you were to grant Ohio State the advantage in some areas, I think they do, and in other areas they don't. The fact of the matter is that this is why a game like this is so important, because the more you lose games like this, the more this mantra of your roster is not as good as their roster continues. Has Ohio State had better rosters than Notre Dame in the last 10 years? Of course, including last year. Do they have a better roster than Notre Dame now? It's debatable. And even if you were to grant that premise, the thing that I would argue is it's not anywhere close to what it was back in recently, where Ohio State had a significantly better roster. And I've argued in the past that their roster in a lot of years is better than anybody in college football. Their 2015 roster was better than anybody in college football. They weren't a great team and an incredibly talented team, though. I mean, you think about that 2015 team and some of the guys that were on that 2015 team, and it's kind of silly when you really sit and think about it. And you're like, how did that team lose at home to Michigan State? How did that team not win a national championship? They were the defending champs. You obviously you still had Cardell Jones and JT Barrett at quarterback. You had this guy named Ezekiel Elliott at running back for that team. You had Michael Thomas at wide receiver. You had Braxton Miller at receiver, Jalen Marshall at receiver, Curtis Samuel at receiver, Nick Vanette at tight end. The defense was loaded as well. You had this guy named Joey Bosa, turned out to be pretty good, was on that team. Your defensive line or your linebacking core had Darren Lee, Josh Perry, Raekwon McMillan on that team. Curtis Grant was on that team in 2015. You had your entire secondary was like high draft picks. Tyvis Powell was one of your safeties. Von Bell was another safety. Eli Apple, Jerrion Conley was on that team. I mean, you had some really talented players like Marshawn Latimer coming off the bench of that team. I mean, that was a really, really ridiculous team. Adolphus Washington was on the team. Sam Hubbard was a freshman on the team that played a lot for that football team. So, that was a really, really loaded team. And my thing is, that's not who they are anymore, in my opinion. At some positions, sure. At other positions, no. And there's a lot of assumptions that are made by even Notre Dame fans about, no, Ohio State's better there. Well, it's like, based on what? Well, this guy did this 2 years ago. Okay, but where are they now? And that's kind of what I wanted to look at. So we're we're going to look at this matchup in two ways. The first way, and I'm not a fan of it, but it's just kind of like I've been asked to respond to this is something that people have asked me to do, and so I'm going to do it. And it's basically looking at position by position who's better right now. There's two ways of looking at it. One is to just look at the entire depth chart, and I don't think that really the entire depth chart doesn't matter a ton. It really comes down to who's in your rotation now. And so when I look at who's better at these different spots, it comes down to looking at it from the standpoint of just breaking down the matchups of who's playing, who's in the rotation, who's going to be counted on. And so when you look at it, then I'm telling you, it's going to shock some people. We're going to start with the offense, and I'm going to state my case, but let's go position by position. Who has the advantage? And this is my breakdown. So I got a chuckle when I saw that the list that I was sent that was initially being responded to had quarterback as an advantage for Ohio State. That kind of made me chuckle a little bit. Ohio State clearly has the receiver advantage. I give Ohio State the tight end advantage. Their production has been better so far, and they've played fewer games. I think Cade Stover is the more steady player. G. Scott's done some really nice things this year. Through 4 games, Notre Dame's tight ends have caught 13 passes for 201 yards. Through 3 games, Ohio State's tight ends have caught 14 passes for 208 yards. Notre Dame has the touchdown advantage, 5-0. But when you look at just the steady play, the blocking of Cade Stover, I'm a very high Cade Stover guy. I give the edge at tight end to Ohio State because of who they are now. Now, if we're going to just sit here and talk about who has more talent on the roster, I think that's advantage Notre Dame. I think Holden Stace is a better talent than anyone that Ohio State has. I think that obviously Eli Raridan is that type of guy too, but Eli Raridan is not playing right now. Mitchell Evans obviously is a very talented player. Cooper Flanagan's a very talented player. So I think the talent advantage goes to Ohio State, but as I'll argue in other cases, that's not really what wins games. It's where is your team now? Who's ready to play for you now? And when you look at the tight end position for Ohio State, it's advantage Ohio State. And then when you look at these breakdowns too, another thing you have to consider is it's not always about, okay, well, 3-2 advantage here or 2-3 advantage or disadvantage there. It also comes down to if the team that has a 3-2 advantage and the advantages are slight and the other team only has 2 advantages, but they're enormous, then those 2 can still outweigh the other 3. That's something to consider too, and we'll break those down as we go. But beginning at quarterback, this is a no-brainer. I mean, Kyle McCord's done some nice things, but what's funny is listening to Ohio State, some, because there's some good Ohio State fans. Obviously, Archer's one of those. We have several. We've had several Ohio State fans that come into our chat that are really, really good. And, but you look at Kyle McCord, it's funny listening to people talk about how, Ohio State has the advantage of quarterback, because if you go back and look at week 1 after the Indiana game, you had a bunch of Ohio State fans talking about how they needed to bench Kyle McCord. Analysts are benching, bench Kyle McCord, all this other type of nonsense, because he didn't have a great game in his first start of the year. And he didn't. He didn't play well that game. He threw for 239 yards, completed 20 of 33 passes, no touchdowns. He threw an interception. Didn't really do a whole lot on the ground, only 8 yards rushing. Didn't play great that first game. Came out, played better against Youngstown. Not great, but better. Went 14 of 20 for 258 yards and 3 touchdowns. And then he was outstanding this past weekend against Western Kentucky. Went 19 of 23. That's 82.6 completion percentage, 318 yards, and 3 touchdowns. So obviously he did a much better job this past weekend. And as y'all know, I've always liked Kyle McCord as a player. I think Kyle McCord's a good football player, but to act as if they have an advantage over Notre Dame and Sam Hartman, to me, is that's not real analysis. That's homer takes, in my opinion. There's really no other way around it when you just look at the experience level. But even just looking at the production this year, we talk about what he did in the second game or his third start against Youngstown State, went 19 of 23. It's exact line that Sam Hartman had in the opener. Kyle McCord had more passing yards. He had 318, 3 touchdowns. Sam Hartman threw for 251 and 4 touchdowns. Game number 2 against Tennessee State, Sam Hartman plays a half of football, goes 14 of 17 for 194 yards, 2 touchdowns, does not play a snap in the second half. Comes out the next week on the road against NC State, goes 15 of 24 for 286 yards, 4 touchdowns. Then last week against Central Michigan, he went 16 of 26 for 330 yards and 3 more touchdowns. So, Kyle McCord is doing some nice things. He's a good football player. I like him. He's completed 69.7% of his passes on the year. Sam Hartman's at 71.1. He is completing, let's go to this one. He is completing or averaging 271 yards per game through the air. Sam Hartman is averaging 265.3. Again, playing fewer snaps in some of those games. He is averaging 10.7 yards per attempt. Sam Hartman's at 11.8. He's got a quarterback rating of 183.24. Sam Hartman has a quarterback rating of 217.81. Sam Hartman also has 2 rushing touchdowns. Kyle McCord does not have any. I think it's very clear right now that the quarterback advantage goes to Notre Dame. And practically speaking, they're going to need this to be true on Saturday. I'll talk a little bit more about it, but I don't know that Notre Dame can win this game if they're unable to have the better quarterback play. It's going to make it much, much harder to win this game if they don't have the better quarterback play. Offensive line-wise, that's a no-brainer. Notre Dame's offensive line is still not a finished product. It's certainly better than Ohio State's, or at least it has been up to this point. Also an area that Notre Dame needs to make sure that's how it plays out on Saturday, that their offensive line plays better than Ohio State's. The one that's going to create some debate, and I think it's going to even create some debate with Notre Dame fans who are going to disagree with me on this, is at running back. And this isn't a ranking of who was ranked higher coming out of high school. It's not a ranking of who's going to be the higher draft pick. I don't really care about that. I care about who has the better backfield going into this game. The reality of Ohio State's situation is that they do not have a healthy running back room completely. Mayan Williams has been a little bit banged up this year. He has not been off to a very good start so far this year. Chip Trainum's doing some nice things for them, and obviously Travion Henderson is starting to get going a little bit. Obviously had his first kind of real breakout game this past week to a degree. 13 carries for 88 yards, 6.8 yards per carry. This past game on the season, he's got 191 yards in 3 games, 6.4 yards per carry, and 4 touchdowns. Chip Trainum transferred from Arizona State. He actually went to Arizona State to play linebacker. Transferred to Ohio State, I believe, to stay at linebacker, and then moved over to running back. He had 5 carries for 56 yards last week against Western Kentucky. He's got 133 yards on 19 carries. And then you look at we haven't seen Dallin Hayden carry the ball once this year. You all know that I'm very high on Dallin Hayden. We've seen Evan Pryor play 1 game, 3 carries for 12 yards. He's coming back from a knee injury, very talented kid. So if we're going to talk about the room, I love Ohio State's running back room. There's a lot of talent. And it comes down to, are you playing that way? And when you look at it in that regard, I give the advantage to Notre Dame's running backs. I talked about the production that Ohio State's guys have. Let's get into the numbers for those who don't want to who don't think that this is the proper take. This is the production so far. This is just running back production so far. This is per game averages, obviously, because if you did total yards, that would be very much a spin, right? If you're just going to go raw numbers and rushing, it'd be spin since Notre Dame has played more games. So we look at it from a per carry and a per game standpoint. This is the running backs, and I didn't even count Notre Dame's backup running backs. So I mean, as far as their their walk-ons and some guys that have got in late in games, because so basically I did not count. Looking at the rushing numbers, I did not count Devin Ford. I did not count Skip Velada. I did not count Chase Ketterer, which would add, let's see, 4.6. That's 5.2. It get Notre Dame over 200 yards if I added those guys. I only counted the guys that are in the rotation, the guys that play on a regular basis. And so it really boiled down to obviously Audric Estime, who's obviously a big part of that. It boils down to Jadarian Price, and it gets down to Jeremiah Love and Jabron Payne. So it really was just those 4 guys. I didn't even include, like I said, Devin Ford, who's only carried the ball 2 times this year. But it gets down to those other players. And when you look at Notre Dame's production on a per-game basis, it's not even close. Notre Dame running backs right now are averaging 198 yards per game. Ohio State's are at 136.3. Notre Dame's running backs are averaging 6.8 yards per carry. Ohio State's running backs are averaging 5.8 yards per carry. Notre Dame's running backs in 4 games have accounted for 16 catches, 176 yards. Ohio State's receivers have counted for 7 catches for 94 yards. Notre Dame's running backs have counted for 9 touchdowns so far, and Ohio State's have accounted for 7. I believe the rushing touchdowns are the same. Notre Dame has 7 rushing touchdowns so far this year. All of Ohio State's running back touchdowns have been rushing touchdowns. Notre Dame's backs have 2 touchdowns in the pass game. So when you look at it from that standpoint, it's advantage Notre Dame. And now here's what the argument is when I hear this from Ohio State people. Well, Notre Dame hasn't played anybody, as if Ohio State has. And so I like to do this right now. Obviously, you look at where teams are right now with their rush defense. It's kind of it's a wash. None of these teams are ranked very high. And for example, Western Kentucky's rush defense right now ranks second to last in the country. I don't think that really gives you an indication of who they are. You look at Indiana ranked 79th, and then of course they played a top, excuse me, an FCS team at this point in time. So let's see where Youngstown State currently is in rushing defense and the FCS level. They are currently ninth in rush defense right now at the FCS level, and no Tennessee State, who Notre Dame played, is 77th. So advantage Ohio State for the FCS opponents. But when it comes down to the Power Five opponents, obviously it's a very clear advantage for Notre Dame. And then when you take into context what these defenses were last year, it's even more in context for Notre Dame. So Navy last year, the number 3 rush defense in the country. NC State had the number 11 rush defense in the country. Western Kentucky last season ranked 61st in rush defense, and Indiana ranked 99th. So whatever context you want to provide, the competition for the rushing for the opponent from a rushing standpoint, rush defense standpoint, shows that Notre Dame has played more productive, more stout rush defenses so far this season, and they still have gone out and rushed for significantly more yards than what Ohio State's running backs have produced in every aspect of the game. So Western Kentucky is the best opponent that Ohio State has faced. They went 9-4, I think, last year. Is it 9-4, 9-5? Let me look up Western Kentucky's record last year. Give me 1 second, folks. I believe they were 9-4, but they might have played in the their conference championship. So let me just look up I do know they won 9 games last year under Tyler Helton. So they were 9-5 last year. So they played in their conference championship game. And actually, no, they also played they played Hawaii. So that allowed them to get some extra work last year as well. And then they played South Alabama in a bowl game. So they went 9-5 last year, lost to Indiana, lost to Troy, lost to North Texas, lost to Auburn last season, lost to UTSA. So it's a quality Western Kentucky team. Notre Dame's best opponent so far is an NC State team that was 8-5 last year and ranked almost the entire year. So again, there's really no argument about the quality of the competition. Neither team has played a great schedule so far, but when it comes to this particular matchup of rush defenses, there's no question that Notre Dame has played a better rush defense, which is why I give the advantage to the Notre Dame running backs in this matchup. And I don't think it's really all that close right now. Now, the key is, again, you've got to make sure that this plays out on Saturday if you're Notre Dame. And then today it comes down to, are you willing to look at this being a matchup of recruiting rankings or what a guy was 2 years ago? Or are you going to look at what it is now and allow your feelings to, overcome the data? That's really what it comes down to for me. Let's go to the defensive side of the ball. This is going to be look a little bit different. I have a tie. That's what that bottom one is. When you look at the D lines against each other, Ohio State has to me, a clear advantage on the defensive line. It's not really just a talent thing for me. I watched the film, and the production's actually not a whole lot different. If you look at the production from the Notre Dame D line to the defensive line for Ohio State, it's not a really vast difference of sacks per game, tackles for loss per game. Notre Dame's defensive line has slightly more pressures per game. And what it really comes down to, however, is I just pop in the film. So when it's close statistically, then you watch the film. And when you watch the film, Ohio State's defensive line is a lot more impressive to me this year than what Notre Dame's has been. Jack Sawyer was just kind of average the first 2 games. He played really well against Youngstown State. JT's been a really pretty good player for them all year. I like their interior guys. Mike Hall is still a very good football player. Tyleek Williams doesn't play a ton. He's a bigger kid, so he doesn't play like a ton of snaps. Bigger kid for them, 295. Ty Hamilton is a solid, steady player inside. Hero Kanu hasn't played a lot of snaps, but when he has been in the game, he's been disruptive. So I think he has a sack already. I think he's maybe played 12 snaps all year and already has a sack for them. So I just like what their defensive line is doing better right now than Notre Dame's. And then, of course, I mean, you can get into the whole the aspect of rankings and all that other stuff that to me, like I said, doesn't really matter. It's just about the play. They've played better and they've had the better team so far at defensive line. Linebackers, again, it's a lot closer than it was last year. It definitely is a lot closer than it was last year, but I still give the edge to Ohio State. I think their linebackers have been more steady. This is one position also where the recruiting rankings are a lot closer than some other positions. Obviously, Notre Dame's has 2 4-star guys that start at linebacker. Ohio State has a 2 4-star guys start at linebacker. You can count a 5-star guy if you count Sonny Styles as a linebacker, which I do. So the recruiting ranking is closer, but even then, it's still advantage Ohio State. But just popping on the film, there's just more consistency from the Ohio State group, a little bit more steady play. I think Notre Dame's linebackers have had more disruptive play this year. I mean, when you look at some of the plays that Maris Leofau has had this year, I think he's been a very disruptive player for Notre Dame. You know, his stuff numbers, but there's just, I like steadiness at linebacker. I really do. And I think the Ohio State kids so far have just been more steady, in my opinion. And that's why I give them the advantage. But it's not a great one. It's the advantage defensive line wise is greater for Ohio State than the linebacker advantage. Cornerback advantage, this is, again, a little closer than I would have predicted before the season because I do think the Ohio State corners have been better than I thought, but it's still not real close, in my opinion. Notre Dame has had significantly better cornerback play so far this year, and that is even with Ohio State being their corners playing better. Just the film tells me that story. The production tells me that story. The numbers that the Notre Dame players have produced so far this year in the pass game compared to Ohio State's guys. And then Notre Dame has great depth at corner. And that's really been a separator in the past because Ohio State would have, maybe you could match their starters, but then they would just roll out, future first. I just mentioned the 2015 team. Marshawn Latimer didn't even start on that team. He ended up being a first-round pick and an excellent player in college. I think he was a freshman at the time. But like I said, when you look at the production for this season, Ohio State's starting corners right now have given up 17 completions on 37 attempts. That's a pretty good number right there. So you're giving up a 45.9% completion rate in 3 games. They've given up 192 yards. This is according to Pro Football Focus, by the way. So 192 yards and a touchdown on 17 of 37 so far in the season. You look at Notre Dame starting cornerbacks. When you look at Cam Hart and Benjamin Morrison, they've given up 7 completions on 21 attempts. So they've given up a lot fewer completions. They've given up a grand total of 7. Ohio State's guys have given up 17 in 1 fewer game. Notre Dame's guys have given up 7 completions on 21 attempts. That's a significantly lower completion percentage rate. That's 33.3. So 7 out of 21. And Notre Dame's receivers have given up a grand total of 100 yards. Starting corners, I should say, have given up a grand total of 100 yards so far this season. And then you include the backups, and it's a similar story. Jaden Mickey's given up 1 completion on 3 attempts for 21 yards. Clarence Lewis, when he's been in there, has given up 3 completions on 7 attempts for only 15 yards. The guy that's given up the most yards so far this year of the backups is Christian Gray, who's allowed 37 yards on 2 completions on 3 attempts. And a lot of that was, coming off the bench. When you look at Ohio State, their top cornerback off the bench is Jordan Hancock. He's given up 57 yards receiving on 6 of 9 so far this season. So clearly the Notre Dame cornerbacks have been a lot more effective this year, a lot more productive this year when it comes to the pass game. Cameron Martinez has given up 1 completion on 1 attempt that was for 36 yards. So even though Notre Dame's played 1 more game, you could say, well, they played Navy, fine. But I believe some of the production that Notre Dame gave up this year, I believe Cam Hart actually gave up a completion against Navy. I'm going to check that number right now. No, he did not. So that he's 2 completions were, he gave up 1 in Tennessee State, 1 against NC State, 1 against Central Michigan. So, yeah, he's only given up 1 completion per game. So I thought that he had given up a catch against Navy, but that must have been somebody else. But even if you take the Navy game out, I mean, the reality is Notre Dame is in more games has given up a lot fewer production at the cornerback position. Safety position, this is the one that I think you could disagree with me the most, in my opinion, because I've been back and forth on this one. Not back and forth on Notre Dame having the advantage, but back and forth on whether it's advantage Ohio State or whether it's advantage it was a wash from an advantage standpoint. And that's why I went with kind of a tie to me. I think Ohio State safeties have been good this season. They've played good football. I like what I've seen from Josh Proctor so far this year. He's been good. Lathan Ransom's been solid. They've been pretty good in the pass game. I think their safeties have been pretty good in the pass game. Jod Carter's given up 2 completions for 23 yards. Malik Hartford's only given up 2 yards on 1 completion. Josh Proctor's only given up 2 yards on 1 completion. Lathan Ransom's only given up 18 yards on 2 completions. They've been pretty good when it comes to defending the pass this year. I like what they've done so far. And I count Sonny Styles as a safety, just so we're clear on this. But I like what I've seen from the Notre Dame guys more on the run. I thought the Navy game was a little bit, sloppy at times, but since then, I think the Notre Dame safeties have been a lot more productive against the run. When you look at their safety play, and this is again Pro Football Focus numbers, the safety with the most run stops on their defense is Josh Proctor with 2. Malik Hartford has 1. Lathan Ransom has 1. So their safeties have 4 total run stops on the year, according to Pro Football Focus. Xavier Watts has 8 by himself. And DJ Brown has 2. Clarence Lewis, Ramon Henderson, and Antonio Carter all have 1. And I would take Clarence Lewis out of that one. So the run production has been significantly better for the safeties. And that's why it came down to a tie for me, is looking at it from that regard. Is if you were to say, okay, how did the Notre Dame safeties stack up against Ohio State safeties so far this year? Number one, if we're going to go pass game, advantage Ohio State. Clear advantage for Ohio State in the pass game. If you're going to talk about the run game, I think it's a clear advantage for Notre Dame. Much more disruptive in the run game. And that's why I made it a wash, honestly, is because it was kind of hard to determine between the two as far as which one is more important. And the missed tackle numbers are similar. There wasn't a big difference there. So that's why I went with a wash. So going to the offense, I have advantage. I have Notre Dame with the advantage in 3 areas, Ohio State with the advantage in 2. Defensively, I have Ohio State with an advantage in 2 areas and Notre Dame with advantage in 1. And then I have them as a wash in the other. And so that's how I have the matchup right now. And, I think you could have some debate about some of these. If you were to look at who has the advantage, I think quarterback is significant. Running back is close. Receiver significant for Ohio State. Tight end is close. Offensive line is significant for Notre Dame so far. Defensive line significant for Ohio State. Linebackers is close. Cornerback is significant for Notre Dame. And it's closer than I thought, but it's still significant, or it would be, but it's still significant for Notre Dame. And then safeties is a wash. So, in my opinion, this is a pretty even matchup. Certain teams have advantages in one areas, another team has an advantage in the other areas, which is why I think a lot of this whole Ohio State's going to walk over Notre Dame, and the only way Notre Dame can compete is if Ohio State plays poorly. There's a lot of those really bad takes out there, and here's why it matters. Let's just say hypothetically Notre Dame wins this game. The problem is a lot of Ohio State fans are going to think that they just choked the game away and they're not any good, and fire this guy, fire that guy, bench this kid, bench that kid. They're going to overreact incredibly because they don't think Notre Dame's a good football team. And that's kind of silly and petty. And just honestly, I use the word ignorant simply from a lack of knowledge standpoint, not as an insulting as it matters, but it really just comes down to that's a you problem, not an Ohio State player problem. This is a top 10 talented football team that you're playing on the road, and losing to them as long as you play a solid game is nothing to sneeze at. And Ohio State's going to have a lot to play for, including a national championship if they lose this game. In the way that I think it could happen. Now, if you get blown out, that means something went wrong and people didn't play well. But if they lose, let's say it's a great game, Notre Dame wins 30-27 on the last second field goal, that's nothing to sneeze at. That's something. I mean, your Ohio State team, that means they battled their butts off. I think the lack of respect for Notre Dame's roster is really creating this really misguided opinion on who Notre Dame is and how convincing the Ohio State game victory should be. And I think that's why it's important to have a realistic view. And same thing for Notre Dame fans. If you think this is a bad Ohio State team, it's the worst Ohio State team I've seen in a long time, and I had people in the offseason, they're going to lose 3 or 4 games. I'm like, you guys are missing it. Ohio State's reloading. That's what they're doing. They're not rebuilding, they're reloading. This is a good football team. This is a really good football team. If Notre Dame beats them, It's not a, well, this isn't as good as they've been in the past. This is a really good football team. This is two really good football teams that, in my opinion, are pretty evenly matched because of the quarterback. And that's really what it comes down to, because had Sam Hartman not come to Notre Dame, the quarterback advantage would be significant for Ohio State. And we've seen what the two kids that were playing quarterback for Notre Dame last year have done so far this year. It hasn't been pretty. And Sam Hartman has obviously played really, really good football. So that's where I give the advantage in this matchup between Notre Dame and Ohio State. There's another way that I want to look at this matchup, and this is not going to so much be from an advantage standpoint. This is just diving into the numbers. I'm going to nerd out here for a little bit, everybody. I'm just going to let y'all know that right now. And the next thing I'm going to do is kind of do what we used to do last year. We did a whole show about this last year, and we'll do it for more of the big games this year. And I don't love doing it beginning of the year because it's hard to really give context to the numbers. But 3 to 4 games in, you start getting a little bit of a better sense of where they are. So let's look at a little bit of a more of a stacking up matchup, because we talked about quarterback versus quarterback. Well, here's the reality: Sam Hartman's never going to be on the field at the same time as Devin Brown. Audric Estime's probably not going to be on the field at the same time as Travion Henderson, unless they've got Travion Henderson running down to cover kickoffs, right? And Marvin Harrison's not going to be on the field at the same time as Chris Tyree or Tobias Merriweather, right? That's not how it works. It's more about, how does your offense compare against their defense, and how does their offense compare against your defense? And that's really what it boils down to. And that's the more practical matchups. And so that's what we're going to dive into, because statistically, these are two very impressive teams. There's no doubt they've handled their business. Ohio State fans were losing their minds, like some Notre Dame fans were after the NC State game, because they only won by 20 on the road against Indiana. And my response is I said this on Twitter after kind of the first couple of weeks, and I was like, guys, I remember watching Ohio State in 2014 get beat by 14 points at home to Virginia Tech. At home, a Virginia Tech team that went 7-6. You know what Ohio State did that year? They won a national championship, right? Like, let's not overreact to early games. And even though Ohio State played what I thought was a really bad game offensively, they still won by 20. And they still shut down Indiana completely, because their defense has played really well in each of their games so far. So this is going to be a fun matchup to break down, and that's what we're going to do next. And this is more of a practical matchup. So let's kind of begin looking at the Notre Dame rushing offense against the Ohio State rushing defense. And on paper, this is a very, very even matchup. Notre Dame currently ranks 28th in the nation in rushing yards per game. Ohio State ranks 20th in the nation in rush defense allowed per game. Obviously, from a yards per game standpoint, Ohio State has the advantage there. Notre Dame has the advantage in yards per play. Notre Dame also has the advantage in tackles for loss. Notre Dame's offense ranks 19th in fewest tackles fewest tackles for loss allowed per game. I gave the raw numbers there because I get more from that. But the ranking actually comes from the per game averages, because it's when you've got more teams playing kind of the different amount of games, it can kind of put it into the improper context. So I went with the per game rank there, just so people are clear. If you try to look it up at cfbstats.com, you'll see that Notre Dame 15 of 7, 15 tackles for loss allowed isn't 19th. I went with the per game average. And then, of course, Notre Dame has been a very good big play offense in the run game this year. They got 4 carries of 30 yards or more. They had another 72-yard touchdown called back this week against Indiana. And Ohio State has yet to allow a rush for over 30 yards, which ties number 1 in the country. And so now, context-wise, here's where I think it's an interesting matchup. When you look at what Ohio State has faced this season from a rushing standpoint, they haven't really faced a lot of teams that are good at running the football. Indiana ranks 109th this season in rushing. Western Kentucky ranks 114th. Neither one of these teams are overly good at running the football last year either. Indiana ranked 112th, and Western Kentucky ranked 70th last year in rushing offense. And then when you look at what Western Kentucky has done against some of the better teams that they've played running the football, it hasn't been always great. They were pretty good against Indiana last year, who was not very good. But then against Auburn, they only ran for 85 yards and 2.9 yards per carry. So a little bit up and down. They're an air raid team, so they run a different type of offense in their name. But I really like the Western Kentucky offense. I do. And so, we can get into rankings and all that. But when you shut down Western Kentucky's offense, for me, whatever the rankings say, that's impressive to me. And so I've really been impressed with what Ohio State's done. And I've been really impressed with what Notre Dame's done. Is obviously, as we talked about context earlier, Notre Dame played teams that, from a rushing defense standpoint, rank much higher than what Ohio State has faced this season from a rushing offense standpoint. And that's obviously a big part of, NC State ranks 52nd, for example, in rush defense. Navy ranks 99th in rush defense. Central Michigan ranks 81st in rush defense. None of them are impressive. Neither of them have played a top 50 team in that particular category, but Notre Dame's rank higher. I don't put a lot of stock in that this early in the season. You've got FCS opponents that can skew stats and all that. That's why I kind of looking at last year, and that's why I point to Navy being number 3 last year in rush defense. NC State being 11th last year in rush defense. Central Michigan was the worst team that they played. They were 70th last year in rush defense. And so it's a great matchup. And this is going to be a big part of what determines the game. I mean, this matchup right here is going to be a huge part of this game. If Ohio State is able to do to Notre Dame what they've done to their other opponents this season, it's going to be tough for me to see Notre Dame winning this game if they can't run the football. It's going to be a challenge. And when you look at Ohio State, when they've been at their best, it's because their rush defense is playing well. They've yet to give up 100 yards in a game this year. Youngstown State actually had the most at 99, and they averaged 3.0 yards per carry. Their other two opponents, Indiana and Western Kentucky, have been under 2.5 yards a carry this season. And that's what Ohio State did to Notre Dame last year. Notre Dame couldn't run the football. Went 76 yards on 30 carries, only averaged 2.53 per carry. And, like I said, when Ohio State's at their best, they're shutting teams down from running the football. Penn State, big reason why Penn State just couldn't stay in that game against Ohio State last year is because they had to put too much on Sean Clifford, and they ended up picking them off and making some big sacks, and that's what allowed Ohio State to pull away in that game. Penn State, as good as their rush defense was, only went for 111 yards last year. And you look, I think there's also a misconception about, the rush defense for Ohio State last year. They weren't a great rush defense from like a ranking standpoint. They were good. They ranked 26, but they had some games that they shut people down. But if you think about how it was compared to where it was the year before, in 2021, they finished 28th in rush defense, right? And you look at it and say, well, that wasn't a real big improvement. But I think it was, actually. I think it was a much bigger improvement for Ohio State in 22 compared to 21, even though the numbers don't necessarily look like a huge difference, just because I think they played some really good rushing teams last year. But Ohio State in 2021 dominated a lot of bad teams in their run defense, like a lot of bad teams. I'll give you some numbers. They held Tulsa to 73. They held Akron to 76. They held Rutgers to 111. Maryland to 56, Indiana to 34. Penn State, who was not a good running team in 2021, to 33. They held Nebraska to 113. They held Purdue to 91. They held Michigan State to 66. Now, the holding Michigan State to 66 one was impressive because that was a team that Kenneth Walker in that game. But overall, that's what they thrived on. That was the only good team that they played that they couldn't stop. Minnesota went for 203, and it would have been a lot more if Muhammad Ibrahim doesn't get hurt. They gave up 269 to Oregon. They gave up 297 to Michigan, and they gave up 226 to Utah. Last year, they didn't have as many of the sub-100 games. They only had 5 compared to the year before. They had 7, and then they had 2 more games of under 120 last year, or 2 in 2021. But I just felt overall the run defense last year just was better on a consistency basis. And even the Michigan game, and we had people in the Ohio State fans talking about this, and it is true. Ohio State didn't get run on by Michigan early. That came in the second half after Michigan had softened them up with the pass game. That's true. Whereas in 2021, Michigan was establishing the run game from jump to finish. I mean, they dominated Ohio State overall. They went to the bowl game. They did a pretty good job slowing down Georgia's run game. Only gave up 135 yards rushing. Gave up 206 to Northwestern. But outside of that, Wisconsin went for 192. But I felt a lot of that came late when the game was already decided. I just felt, even though the statistics didn't show it, that Ohio State was a much more effective rushing defense last year, and they're even better this year. And a big reason why is for their success is they haven't had to scheme their way into success this year. Now, that can sound insulting, but it's not. it comes down to this. It's like, can I stop you playing my base defense? Do I have defensive linemen good enough to just whoop your guys up front, which allows my linebackers to flow and read and react and fly to the football? And so far through 3 games, Ohio State's been able to do that. And they haven't had to dial up a lot of pressures and things like that. I think we'll see more of that against Notre Dame, because Notre Dame has faced a lot of that. They got teams throwing all types of run stunts and crazy stuff at them in these games, and Notre Dame still goes out there and finds ways to get the ground game going. Their least effective game so far this year was against North Carolina State, in a game where Notre Dame rushed for 170 yards on 37 carries. And a big part of that was they went for 4.6 yards per carry. But a big part of that was Notre Dame gave up. That was the game that they gave up the most sacks. If you actually look at just the pure rushing numbers in that game, let's see, I'll pull this up here real quick. If you just look at the pure rushing numbers, you see Audric Estime had 134 net rushing. Jadarian Price had 31. Jeremiah Love had 24. Jabron Payne had 6. So that right there, so 165, 189, 195. So you had 195 rushing yards from the backs in that game that year, or that in that game against Ohio State, or excuse me, NC State. So, and that again, that was a team that had, if you look at it, like as I said, that's a team that had finished 11th in the country the year before in rush defense. So even then, Notre Dame was still able to find a way to get it done, and they ripped off the big play, went for 191 against Navy and 236 against Central Michigan. So both teams have been very good in this department. Both teams have been very good in this department as well. Again, another very close matchup. The yards per game, obviously advantage Ohio State. Part of that is because Notre Dame's been a very balanced team. They're one of the few teams in the country that are over 300 passing and over 200 rushing so far. Yards per play, very close. Notre Dame leads the nation in touchdown passes, partly because they've played more games, tied for first with fewest turnovers. They're third in pass efficiency and third in big plays and most big pass plays. They're third in pass plays of 30 yards or more. Ohio State hasn't picked the ball off a lot. Obviously, part of that is that ranking is there's teams ahead of them that have played 4 games. So that's obviously part of it. Actually, let me just give you the actual number of teams that are ahead of them that have played more games. So Ohio State is ranks 45th. So of the teams that rank ahead of them, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 teams that have played 4 games. And then there's of the teams that are tied with them in the 45 spot, there's one more team that has played one more than them. So you're probably talking that put them being in the 30s, 3 interceptions. That's 1 per game. That's a solid production. Not great. They haven't been a great turnover team, but they're just stout right now in the pass game. And this is against. Now, keep in mind, we talked about context for the rush defense. They haven't played anybody that runs the football very well. Indiana's a pretty bad passing offense. They're not a good passing offense at all. They ranked 87th in the country last year, only 5.4 yards per attempt, but Western Kentucky ranked 2nd in college football last year at 352.1 yards per attempt, or yards per game, 7.9 yards per attempt, 43 touchdowns. Their quarterback, Austin Reed, passed for 4,744 yards and 40 touchdowns last year. He is back, and he went 21 of 37 for only 207 yards and a touchdown and a pick against Ohio State. So, when we're gonna look at context, that's impressive production to do that against that Western Kentucky team. Notre Dame obviously has not played teams that have great pass defenses so far. Some solid ones. Obviously, Central Michigan's had a decent secondary, but statistically they weren't very good. NC State has been a pretty good secondary and a pretty good pass defense, but not an elite one. So Notre Dame has done what they needed to do against teams that aren't very good. This will be by far the best pass defense they're going to face. And I would argue that it's in the conversation for the best pass defense they're going to face all year if Ohio State keeps doing what they've done the first 3 games, which has been impressive. And this is, again, going to be a very important part of this game. Notre Dame has to be able to protect their run game with the pass game. If they can't be one-dimensional in either way. They can't just be a pass-only team. They can't be a run-only team. They have to have balance. That's what's worked for Notre Dame so far. They've been able to go out there this year and be balanced, as I talked before. Their lowest rushing game is 170. They've gone for 191, 221, 170, and 236. right? So and then the past game has been they went for 253 in the opener, but then 336 against Tennessee State, 286 against NC State, and then 342 against Central Michigan. They're averaging 300 over. They're averaging over 300 yards per game, and they're averaging over 200 yards per game rushing. And so there just aren't a lot of teams that are doing that. They're not going to do that against Ohio State. I don't see any chance of that happening. But what Notre Dame needs to do, however, is they need to have some semblance of balance. And the concern that I have is that Ohio State's able to shut Notre Dame's pass game down early, which then allows them to put more resources to shutting the run game. So if the Ohio State corners are outplaying the Notre Dame receivers, and I'll get into that here in a little bit, then that's going to allow them to use their rover more to get down in the box. It's going to allow them to trigger their safeties more to get down in the box to slow the run game. So the receivers are going to have to come out and play at a high level in this game and win that matchup. When you look at the overall numbers, obviously both of these teams are very stout. Ohio State has the advantage in scoring. They have the advantage in total yards, had advantage in yards per play. But again, in scoring and yards per play, they're both top 10 teams. Notre Dame has the advantage in third down. And here's the biggest advantage right here is red zone. Notre Dame currently ranks 24th in the country in red zone offense, and they rank 10th in touchdown percentage. Notre Dame has gotten to the red zone 15 times this year. 13 of them have resulted in touchdowns, which is a very impressive number for Notre Dame and certainly an improvement over where they were last year. If you look at Notre Dame last year, they had 35 touchdowns on 50 red zone attempts, which was a 70% rate last season. Notre Dame this year, they're actually on. I believe they're on pace to have fewer red zone touchdowns. Let me just do this math here real quick. Times 13. Yeah, they're on pace for more. They're on pace for 42 red zone touchdowns. The reason I thought they were on pace for less is because they've had so many big play touchdowns, but they're still on pace for more than they had last year, even with the fact they've scored so many long touchdowns this season. And that's that next statistic. Notre Dame is currently second in the country right now in touchdowns or plays of 30 yards or more. They're obviously coming off of a game this past week where they had two 70-yard touchdowns in the game, 76-yard pass touchdowns, 75-yard pass touchdowns. So actually see where Notre Dame ranks in plays of 50. I think they're still top 10 in plays of 50 or more as well. Let me just go look here real quick. Notre Dame is third in plays of 50 yards or more. And two of the teams with them or ahead of them have played in the same number of games. And then, of course, if you just look at Power 5 teams, Notre Dame is second behind UCLA. And, if you look at Power 5 teams. So, obviously, Notre Dame has been a much more effective big play offense this year. Notre Dame, as I said, has 5 plays of 50 yards or more in 4 games. Last year, Notre Dame only had 3 plays of 50 yards or more the entire season. Notre Dame, so far this season, they are currently ranked number 1 in the nation in most plays of 40 yards or more. So they rank second in 30 yards or more. They rank number 1 in gains of 40 or more. Now, they've played one more game. They actually still lead the nation. I did the math this week. I think I'm correct on this. They also lead the nation in most plays of 40 yards or more per game this season. So 11 in 4 games. And the interesting thing is, and I broke this down earlier in the week, last year in 13 games, Notre Dame only had 6 plays of 40 yards or more the entire season. They have almost doubled up last year's production in 4 games. So, say, well, they're not playing very good teams. Okay, agree to disagree. We talked about NC State, but they played some not very good teams last year too and couldn't have this kind of success. And actually 2 of the plays that they got last year were in a bowl game. They had a 40-plus yard touchdown pass against from Braden Lindsey to Braden Lindsey in that game. They also had a 79-yard touchdown run or touchdown catch and run by Logan Diggs. And then Logan Diggs almost had another one. He had a 39-yard touchdown run in that game as well. But they only had 6 plays of 40 yards or more last year. They've already got 11 this year. Ohio State's been good at not giving up those big plays, right? They rank second in the country in scoring defense at 6.7 points per game. The points they've given up so far this year is 10 to a Western Kentucky team that came in, had scored 41 in their opener against South Florida, 52 in game 2 against Houston Christian, and a team that averaged 36.4 points per game a year ago for the season. And even against Auburn last year, a Power 5 team, they scored 17 points, and against Indiana last year, they scored 30 points. So that's a good offense, a good offense that had a lot of talented players coming back, and they held them to 10 points. So it was very, very job well done. If you haven't watched that game, you want to know why I'm very high on the Ohio State defense, watch the Western Kentucky game. You're not going to learn a lot about the Indiana game. You're not going to learn a lot from Youngstown State. Neither of those teams are good. It's like watching Notre Dame's pass defense against Navy and Central Michigan. They're just not very good teams. Watch them against Western Kentucky. And Malachi Corley is a good football player. Austin Reed's a good football player for that level. They did a really good job this week. And they did it without getting a ton of pressures. I mean, they had decent pressures, but they weren't like just getting after the quarterback every play. They really haven't been an overly disruptive team this year. You look at the sack numbers, they rank 95th in the country in sacks per game. Like tackles for loss, I did a per game average on that. And they haven't been a super disruptive team from a sack standpoint. You guys know my stance. Sacks can be very misleading, but just overall pressures. I pointed out in our show yesterday that Notre Dame has more pressures per game than Ohio State does so far, and Notre Dame has been great at getting pressures on a consistent basis. So they're just doing their job at a high level, guys. That's the best thing that I can do to explain this is when you look at this matchup. And so what we're seeing on Saturday is a matchup of what has been so far one of the elite offenses in college football. Top 10 team in points per game, top 5 team in yards per play, top 20 team in rushing yard or passing yards per game or passing yards per attempt, top 10 passing yards per completion, top 10, top 30 team in rushing offense. And you don't see a lot of teams that are top 30 teams in both and are over 200, 300 in both. And against an Ohio State defense that so far has been outstanding. Need to get the tea there to get everything rolling here during the show. Let's move on to the next breakdown. This is a breakdown of the Notre Dame defense against the Ohio State offense. Now, the interesting thing is Ohio State's offense has been kind of what's fueled them in recent seasons. They've been the opposite of Notre Dame. They've been more of a team that hasn't had great defenses in recent years, and in some years just downright bad defenses, and their offense has been elite. And Notre Dame's been a team that's had really average to bad offenses in just about every year, and their defense has been what's carried them to playoff games and the BCS title game and all of that. Well, this year, obviously, Ohio State's a little bit different. Ohio State looks a little bit more like a Notre Dame team from the past, right? Where, they did much better this past weekend. Obviously, scored over 60 against Western Kentucky, who doesn't have a great defense. That it's more impressive what they did to the Western Kentucky offense than what they did to the Western Kentucky defense. But they haven't been great this year on offense. They're not running the ball that well. The passing yards are good, but they feasted on big plays a lot, kind of like Notre Dame in that regard. But Notre Dame's defense has been pretty good statistically this season, and we'll dive into that, but also has shown some warts as well. So both of these teams have had some moments of really good play when you look at the Ohio State offense against the Notre Dame defense. But they've also had some things where you're like, well, how's that going to translate when you play a better team? I think that's something that's a legitimate argument for both of these teams. When you look at the Notre Dame defense or the Notre Dame rush defense, and you look at it and you take out the Navy game, obviously Navy ran for 126 yards in that game. That's a triple option team. Notre Dame did a pretty darn good job in that game against them. They held Tennessee State to 89 yards, held NC State to 84 yards, and they gave up 131 yards to Central Michigan. That was by far their worst performance. Central Michigan was the first team to go for over 3 yards a carry. They went for 3.9. The 3 previous teams were held to 2.8, 2.5, and 2.6. So they've been pretty good against the run this year. This is going to be a much tougher test for Ohio State. Ohio State started to get their run game going a little bit last week. It didn't like really go off. They went for 204, 6.2 yards per carry against Western Kentucky. Western Kentucky's rush defense is not very good. They gave up 155 to Houston Christian. They gave up 374 to South Florida. South Florida averaged 6.1 yards per carry. Ohio State averaged 6.18 yards per carry. So, the context is, well, how good is the Ohio State rush game really? We're going to find out on Saturday. And if you're Notre Dame, you need to make sure that it's not real good. And we'll dive into this more tomorrow, but stopping the run game is going to be incredibly, incredibly important for Notre Dame. And I'll explain why. When you look at yards per attempt, Notre Dame's rushing defense is on par with where Ohio State is. Touchdowns, they're very close in rankings. Ohio State's offense has been very good at limiting negatives this year. They rank 12th in tackles for loss allowed per game. Notre Dame has not been a very disruptive defense. We've talked about that now for the last couple of weeks. They rank 118th in tackles for loss per game. Ohio State has had 2 rushing plays of over 30 yards this year. Notre Dame is yet to allow a rush of over 30 yards this season. And so very similar numbers there. Notre Dame's defensive line has been a little inconsistent, I would say, this year. Linebacker, I don't think it's a coincidence that the worst rushing game they had this season was with J.D. Bertrand out this past week. I don't think that's a coincidence. He'll be back this game. That'll be huge. You'll get Gabriel Rubio most likely back as long as he has no setbacks. He'll be back this week, which will help give a little beef inside. But it really is going to come down to line play. How does Notre Dame's defensive line handle Ohio State? This is, Ryan was talking about how they're not as big as they were last year, and that's very true, but they're not small. They're 300 at center. I think they're like 315 at one guard spot. I think Donovan Jackson's around 310 at the other. Both of their tackles are 310 or better. They're not huge like they were last year, but they still have good size. And Notre Dame's defensive line is going to certainly face a good test here. NC State is a very similar comp. Ryan and I discussed that yesterday. I think NC State's offensive line has played better so far this year, but Ohio State has a little bit more high-end talent, in my opinion. They just haven't played to that level yet. Carson Hinsman being a redshirt freshman is part of that. He's going to be fine as the season goes on. Matthew Jones is a solid player. Donovan Jackson's a really good football player. So the Notre Dame defensive line is going to have to be on top of their game. I mean, this is really one of the biggest matchups of the game. They cannot allow Ohio State to run the ball on them. Last year, Ohio State kept trying to throw it. Notre Dame did a really good job of keeping their pass game in check. And you'll hear all the excuses from Ohio State people. Jackson Smith and Jigba didn't play. He didn't. That's very true. But they still have Marvin Harrison and Emeka Egbuka and all the guys they're going to have now. Those guys were sophomores that didn't play a whole lot the year before. Very true. Jaden Mickey and Benjamin Morrison were true freshmen who played a lot of snaps in that game. So the fact of the matter is that Notre Dame did a good job against their pass game last year. They're going to have to do that again this year. But the reason that Notre Dame lost that game is defensively. Now, offensively, they lost because they couldn't score. But defensively is because Ohio State started to lean on them in the second half. And Ohio State finished with 172 yards last season in rushing on Notre Dame, 4.9 per carry, which was, Notre Dame just second half just couldn't stop them from running. I mean, third quarter and then this fourth quarter just kept leaning on them. And they didn't rip off really any big runs, but it was like 7 yards, 9 yards, 12 yards, 5 yards, just leaning on them and really ran the clock out in the second half. And Notre Dame wasn't going to win that game because their offense couldn't score. And Ohio State knew that. But that's what really put that game away was their ability to run the football. Notre Dame cannot allow them to do that again this year because it will be much harder now, in my opinion, to keep the pass game down that way if they're balanced. If they come out and they're able to run the football, you're going to have a really hard time keeping them from throwing the football as well because you're going to have to then commit more resources to stopping the run. So it's imperative that they thrive in this area. And Ohio State hasn't been great there, and you can't allow them to be great there. They're doing a lot of different things, like with 13 personnel and 12 personnel and moving the tight ends and trying to get the ball outside and trying to do some different things. This is the matchup more than any other that, in my opinion, Notre Dame has to dominate on the defensive side of the ball. And it's the same matchup is true on the other side. Let's look at the pass game. This is a matchup of two very good units. Ohio State ranks 17th in the country in passing yards per game. They also rank in the top 20 in yards per attempt, yards per pass attempt, yards per completion, and fewest sacks allowed. They've only allowed 3 sacks in their 3 games, only 1 per game. Notre Dame currently ranks 4th in the country in fewest yards allowed per game. They rank 13th in the country in fewest yards per attempt. They also rank in the top 20 in fewest touchdowns allowed, which is an impressive number when you consider they have played an extra game. They also rank top 20 in interceptions, and they rank number 1 in college football in pass efficiency defense. If you take the Navy game out, Notre Dame still ranks in the top let's see, they're still top 10, or actually they fall a little bit in yards. I think maybe 12th or 13th in yards, but they're still top 10 in yards per pass efficiency defense. They're still in the top 15 in yards per attempt. So none of those numbers really change when you take away the Navy game. Somebody asked what data points go into pass efficiency defense. It's attempts, completions, yards, and touchdowns. So essentially, if you're a high yards per completion, yards per attempt team, you're going to have a higher passer rating. And then obviously you have negative points for interceptions, and you get positive points for touchdowns. So those are the numbers that go into it. And the reason that Notre Dame is as effective as they are in few yards per attempt, even though they're not great in yards per completion, they rank 66 in the country right now in fewest yards per completion, is because they have teams have just not completed a high number of passes on Notre Dame. Notre Dame currently ranks second in college football in lowest pass completion percentage allowed at 44.3 on the season. Ohio State, their pass defense ranks 33rd. It's pretty good, but they've given up 55.8. So Notre Dame is over 11 percentage points lower. If you take the Navy game out and you look at the Notre Dame's pass completion percentage when you take the Navy game out, just so for context, Notre Dame has given up 40 completions outside of the Navy game on 90 attempts. That's a 44.4% completion rate. So people say, Navy doesn't count because Navy didn't play. It doesn't move the needle at all. Notre Dame was 44.3 with Navy. It's 44.4 without Navy. Same thing with yards per attempt. Notre Dame is a little better in yards per attempt. If you take the Navy game out, because Notre Dame actually allowed Navy to pass for. Let me go out here real quick and pull this up. Navy went for let's see here, 2023. Navy went for 6.1 yards per attempt. So if you take the Navy game out and look at the Notre Dame statistics there, it actually improves Notre Dame's record standing, even though it doesn't improve. It doesn't improve their ranking. It does improve their standings. Let me just do the math here. Divided by 90. So Notre Dame would be 5.15 yards per attempt if you take the Navy game out, which doesn't improve their ranking at all. The team ahead of them, Rutgers, is like 5.105 or something like that. So it doesn't improve their ranking. But the point being, if you're saying, well, they played Navy, this doesn't change anything if you take the Navy game out. Notre Dame is still 13th in passing yards per attempt. They're still number one in pass efficiency defense. They're still second in college football in lowest yards allowed per attempt. That's all still there. Now, what is also true is none of the teams they have faced so far are anything like Ohio State passing the football. That's also true. Now, Ohio State ranks 17th in college football in yards per game. 18th, they're top 20 in yards per game. Yards per attempt at 18. Yards per completion, they're 15th. And then fewest sacks allowed, as I mentioned. When you look at touchdowns, that's a number that's a little skewed, again, because they've played 3 games. There are some other teams that have played 4. So that's obviously a number. They rank 24th in pass efficiency. And a big part of that is the first game. The Ohio State's first game of the year, they had it was their lowest pass efficiency game of the season. They were at 108.07. Last 2 games against Youngstown State, they were 185.02. Then against Western Kentucky, they were 234.34. So they were a much more effective team throwing the football in games 2 and 3. All their touchdowns came in game 2 or 3. They've been over 10 yards per attempt in games 2 and 3. So, obviously the Indiana game so far is the anomaly. Notre Dame's going to have to be effective. Now, I've heard a lot of people say, well, look, you haven't faced a pass offense like this and all. And look, Notre Dame last year did a pretty good job against the better passing teams on their schedule. We talked about this. Notre Dame last season in college football, let me just pull up their rank real quick. In last season, Notre Dame ranked in college football. They were, give me one second, got to look it up. They were 41st in yards in quarterback rating last season. They finished 23rd in yards per attempt last season, and they finished 23rd in fewest yards allowed per game last season. And when you think about who they played last year, that's some pretty impressive context, in my opinion, because last season Notre Dame had to play C.J. Stroud, number 2 pick in the draft. They had to play Drake May. They had to play Caleb Williams. They had to play Spencer Rattler. They had to play Tanner McKee, who's in the NFL now, and they had to play Jaron Hall from BYU. So, Notre Dame played some really good quarterbacks last season and still had a top 25 deep pass defense in yards per attempt and pass efficiency defense. And so I think that's obviously something that you can build on. But this is a different animal when you look at these receivers for Ohio State. This is a different animal. They're big, they're fast, they're deep. They can just run numbers at you, right? And they've got a really good tight end in Cade Stover. The key for Notre Dame in this game is going to be the number at the very bottom down here. Is Notre Dame has not been a team that's been very good at getting pressure on the quarterback consistently this season, and Ohio State's been pretty good so far in keeping people off their quarterback. That cannot continue for Notre Dame against Ohio State this week. If Ohio State's able to give Kyle McCord a pocket and time to throw, he will find some big plays in the pass game. It's you just can't allow him to just sit there in the pocket. You've got to find ways to get pressure with your front. You've got to find ways to get pressure with your linebackers, both of them. And not do it in a way that exposes you to getting burned for the big plays. This is going to be a really big matchup. You've got one of the best secondaries in college football, certainly one of the best cornerback tandems in college football against the best receiving core in college football. I love the kids at Washington. I do. You all know that. I've been talking about Washington. I had them as a playoff team this year. I have them, what do I have them, like number 3 in my current ranking right now. Love Roma Dunze. He's off to a great start. Love Jalen McMillan. Jalen Polk's been good. Jeremy Bernard's been really good. They got 5 guys over 100 yards already in 3 games. Love that receiving core. It's not as good as Ohio State's. It's just not. I think Ohio State, to me, has the best receiving core in college football. And it's not just 2 guys, right? It's not just like Marvin Harrison and Emeka Egbuka. Right now, Emeka Egbuka is 3rd on that team in receiving yards. Cade Stover's 2nd. Julian Fleming's over 100 yards. Cardinal Tate is already got 4 catches for 75 yards and a touchdown. And so this is going to be a big test for Notre Dame, and it's going to be a battle up front. They're going to have to play well up front. That's going to be a big key to this game in this battle. Let's look at the overall numbers. Obviously, Notre Dame, great number so far. They rank 14th in the country in fewest points per game allowed at 11.8. They have and then if you really think about it, some of those touchdowns, like the touchdown they gave up to NC State late in the game, was against their backups. Ohio State ranks 20th this year in points per game. Notre Dame ranks 3rd in the country in yards and fewest yards per game. Also ranks 3rd in yards per play. Ohio State ranks 24th and 12th in that category. Notre Dame has this is a great stat because of how different it was last year. They ranked 12th in red zone defense and 9th in red zone touchdown defense. Now, what makes that statistic impressive, and if you're an Ohio State fan and you're not familiar with where Notre Dame was last year, and you're wondering why we're fired up about the statistic, last year Notre Dame's defense ranked 2nd to last, 130 out of 131 teams in red zone defense. Opponents last season scored on 32 of 34 attempts in the red zone against Notre Dame. And so Notre Dame this year has already had way more stops than they did last year. They've had 5 stops this year, where they only had 2 all of last year. And the only team that was worse than was Rutgers, was only worse by them by 1 point. They were closer to being last than they were to being 129th last season. And red zone defense, touchdown defense, they were dead last season, dead last in college football. And last year, opponents scored on 27 of 34 trips into the red zone. So on 34 trips, they allowed touchdowns on all but 7 possessions. Already through 4 games, Notre Dame has had 8 red zone stops as far as not letting touchdowns. That's going to be a big part of this game. Ohio State ranks 48th and 52nd in those 2 categories. Notre Dame has allowed 4 plays already of 30 yards or more, which ranks 30th. That's a couple too many, in my opinion. Ohio State has had 7 plays of 30 yards or more this season, which ranks them 54th. Both teams are sort of just mediocre when it comes to turnovers. Notre Dame hasn't forced as many as they should. Ohio State hasn't turned the ball over much. They've only had 3 turnovers in the season. I believe it's 2 interceptions and 1 fumble. When it comes to this, Notre Dame's interesting thing too, because we've talked about it on our other shows. They've forced 7 fumbles this season. Teams have had 7 forced fumbles this season, or fumbled the ball 7 times. Notre Dame's recovered none of them. That has to change against Ohio State. The turnovers are going to be such an important part of this game. Maximizing possessions for both offenses is going to be a huge part of this game in both areas. And so you're going to have to see Notre Dame be able to have some success ending the Ohio State possessions with negatives, whether it be tackles for loss and sacks, and then also turnovers are going to be a big part of it. But, obviously Notre Dame's defense statistically has been very, very good so far this year. This is just a different animal than what they faced so far. It just is. This is a much better football team, much better offensive football team, better talent, just better scheme than really what they faced all year so far. And Notre Dame is going to have to be up for the challenge. So that's a look at the actual matchup that matters when you look at those different aspects of the game in this battle between Notre Dame and Ohio State. All right. Last part of the show, and I will answer some super chats at the end of this. So it looks like we have 6 super chats. I'm going to dive into there's really sort of 3 players and or kind of positions that need to really step up on Saturday. So when you look at what does Notre Dame need to do to win this game, the big thing for me is this is why am I confident that Notre Dame can win this football game? Am I saying they're going to win? Am I guaranteeing? No, I'm not doing that. I don't do that stuff. If I knew exactly who was going to win, I'd be much richer. Or I'd be rich, period. If I knew who was going to win football games and could predict that, I would be a very wealthy man right now. That's what I love about college football is the unpredictability of it. I was certain that Notre Dame Clemson was going to be a dogfight last year. Certain of it. That Notre Dame was going to win. I just felt that they were going to win, but I really thought it was going to be a dogfight. If you'd have told me before the game that Notre Dame was going to win by 21 points, I'd have said, come on, man, like that's a homer take, right? So who really knows who's going to win these games, right? None of us know, right? I had Notre Dame winning 27-20 last year. So I don't know who's going to win this game, but here's why I'm confident that Notre Dame can win this football game and doesn't have to play out of their minds and everything go right and Ohio State lays an egg and all those type of things. The reason I don't feel that way is because I believe this Notre Dame football team is deep and talented and well coached and tough and physical and has great leadership. It's experienced. All those things are true. And it's a game where Notre Dame doesn't have to play their A+ game to win. That's just not true of this football team this year. It was last year. You needed to play your A game and you needed Ohio State to play like a C+ B- game in order to win that game last year. And I would argue really, Ohio State kind of played their B- game. It's just Notre Dame played a C- game last year against Ohio State. So I believe this Notre Dame football team can compete against Ohio State and win the football game if they can just execute, make plays. So then you get into like the personnel. Again, I think this is a really talented Notre Dame football team. The difference, however, between Notre Dame and Ohio State to me, and this is where I think there is understandably why there is why Ohio State is the favorite in this game. Not just track record and Notre Dame doesn't win big games. We've already talked about that this week, and that's true. But when you look at the talent, there's more known commodities nationally at Ohio State. Everybody knows who Marvin Harrison is. Everybody knows who Emeka Egbuka is. Everybody already knows who Cade Stover is. They don't know who Holden Stace is. They all know who Donovan Jackson is and Jack Sawyer and JT and Mike Hall and Tommy Eichenberg and Denzel Burke and those type of guys. Everybody knows who those guys are. Not as many people know who Joe Alt is and people know who Benjamin Morrison is. But outside of that, does anybody in the national, from a national standpoint or Ohio State fans know who anybody for Notre Dame is outside of Hartman, Alt, and Benjamin Morrison? No. You've got Ohio State people literally like almost bragging about it this summer, bragging about how they don't even know who anybody in the players on Notre Dame's team are, which is kind of a sad self-own, but, it is what it is. But the fact is Notre Dame doesn't have a lot of known commodities. And that's why I think there's this misconception, in my opinion, a misconception of Ohio State has more talent. Ohio State has more established talent. And so when Notre Dame is going to win this game, some of the non-established players need to step up. Because the other part of this game is I don't think Notre Dame can win if their stars don't play like stars. If Sam Hartman doesn't play well, if Joe Alt doesn't play well, if Benjamin Morrison and Cam Hart don't play well, I don't think Notre Dame can win this football game. I don't think they're good enough to win a game like this if the majority of their stars don't play like stars. Like if one of them doesn't, but the others do, that kind of thing, then they can. But they need their stars to play like stars. You need Sam Hartman to play well. You obviously need Benjamin Morrison to be on top of his game. But there's other players to me that aren't sort of the spotlight players. that need to step up and play well in this game. And that's what this final section of the show is going to be about. Probably do this for about 15 minutes, and then we'll get into super chats. Let's start with the Notre Dame offense. To me, the first one that I look at, because I'm looking inside out. That's how I look at these breakdowns. That's how I did it as a coach. You look inside out. We got to figure out how to get the run game going and protect the quarterback before we figure out what pass routes we're going to do, right? Those are obviously big keys. And so that's how I look at this game. And it starts with the guards. Look, they've got to play well. This is a concerning matchup for me when I look at this matchup against Ohio State, because Ohio State doesn't have a very big offensive line or defensive line. We talked about this yesterday. Let me pull the Ohio State roster up again. I think their biggest guy is, I believe it's as far as like the guys that play a lot of snaps, I believe Ty Hamilton is their biggest guy. Ty is, let's see, he's 295. Mike Hall's only 6'2", 280. Ty Hamilton is 6'3", 295. The other tackle that plays a bunch for them is Tyleik Williams. He's 6'2", 290. So they're not real big guys. They play Hero Kanu, who's listed at 305. But you look at Jaden McKenzie, who plays for them. He's 6'2", 286. They just don't have a lot of big guys up front. Their ends have some size to them. Obviously, JT is 270. I think Jack Sawyer's listed at like 265. Let me pull up Jack Sawyer here real quick. Where's Jack? He's 265. They play Caden Curry, who's 260. Kenyatta Jackson plays. He's 258. Like, that's a pretty decent size for edge players, but they're not guys that are out there that are like 295 pounds. They don't have a bunch of 300-pounders inside. And so for all the people that complain about Notre Dame, oh, you don't have enough 300-pounders. Literally, Ohio State has 0 300-pounders that have on their D-line that have played more than 10 snaps in 3 games. 0. Because I believe Hero Kanu has played fewer than 10 snaps. Actually, I like to be correct when I say things like that. So let me just make sure that Hero is actually under 10 snaps per game. So just give me a second, because I don't want to say something that's not accurate. So let's pull up their defensive snaps according to Pro Football Focus. Let's go to their interior defensive line, and Hero Kanu has played. I was incorrect. He has played 24 snaps. So they have one guy that has played over 300 snaps. That's played 20 or more snaps. It's over 300 pounds. Tyleik Williams has played 115 snaps. Michael Hall has played 86 snaps. Ty Hamilton has played 82 snaps, and Jaden McKenzie has played 34 snaps. So Hero Kanu, who's over 300 pounds, is played significantly fewer snaps than those other guys have, right? So they are a smaller D line, but they're quick. They're none of them are tall. They're not long, but they use that to their advantage. They stay low. They get under your pads. They beat you into gaps. They get up under your chest. They knock you back. And even though they don't have a lot of production from a tackles for loss standpoint, Ohio State's not a team that's out there with, 25 tackles for loss in 8 games. They haven't been that super, super disruptive team so far, which I showed in the statistics. What do I have Ohio State's defense at? They rank, 95th in the country in sacks per game. They rank 73rd in the country in tackles for loss per game. They're not a super, super disruptive defense, but what has made them so effective is they still do, I think, get good penetration up front. They force running backs to make early cuts and early decisions. And I've always said this: when you can force a running back to make a cut behind the line, that's a win for the defense, unless that cut is because he's cutting to a wide open, back cut. But if you can force him to cut, meaning he doesn't want to cut, you're forcing him to cut, that's a win for the defense, because once he makes that cut, so let's say Audric Estime's coming downhill on a duo or an inside zone, and Mike Hall just whoops one of the guards off the line, knocks him back or shoots the gap, and Audric has to bounce it outside, 2.5, 3 yards behind the line. Guess what that says to the linebackers and the safeties and the corners? That's where the ball's going. Go, fly to the ball. And they've got a pretty fast defense, in my opinion. At least it's, safety and corner. They're not like burners, but they've got really good speed on the back end of their defense. And so Mike Hall, so Audric bounces it. He gets a yard. He gets stuffed. And you look at it and say, hey, Steele Chambers with the tackle for a 1-yard game. Great job, Steele. But when you look at it, the statistics show Steele Chambers had to run stuff. But the guy that made that play is Mike Hall, who had the penetration, forced the guy to bounce outside and cut early, and then you made the stop. And so when you look at Notre Dame, they've got big guards. Rocco's 315. Pat Coogan's, I think, 303, 305. Not huge, but compared to their D tackles, he's got some size, but he's a tough kid. Zeke Carell's 305. But the guards have struggled with quickness this season. I was encouraged by how they handled the kid from Central Michigan last week, who was like 6'1", 295, and pretty athletic kid. But against NC State, they really struggled with Davin Ham's quickness. They really struggled with CJ Curry's quickness. And that's why Notre Dame was boom or bust in the run game against NC State. And so your guards are going to need to play at a higher level than they did against NC State. And that puts them in a really big matchup over what you could argue has been the best part of Ohio State's team this year, which is their defensive line. The best part of their defense so far, which is their defensive line and the interior guys. So you're going to be in a big matchup in this game and up the middle. Your guards have to play well. The guards played great against Clemson last year. And they didn't always play great, but they stepped up in that big moment. They need to step up in this game. The guards have to play well. I have a hard time believing that Notre Dame can score enough points to win this game if the guards get dominated. I just don't. They're going to have their losses. They're going to give up their negatives. They're going to give up some pressures every now and then, but you got to limit those, severely limit those, and then be effective on early downs. You've got to win that matchup. Staying up front, number 2 is Blake Fisher. Blake has had a very odd season so far. I could cut up a highlight tape of Blake Fisher through 4 games and take like his top 15, 20 snaps and show it to you. And you're like, wow, man, that guy's playing at a high level. Then I could take his worst 20 snaps of the season and you're like, dude, how's that guy starting? Or why is that, why isn't this getting dealt with? Blake has been really up and down so far this year. I think it was the Navy game. I thought he played really well. I thought the right side was pretty good that game. He's been very inconsistent since then. This is a game where Blake has to be on top of his game. Joe Alt was solid against Ohio State last year. Blake struggled against Ohio State last year. Neither of them played great. You obviously need Joe to play great. I talked about that. Your stars got to be stars, but they need Blake Fisher to play at a high level. This is one of those. This has got to be sort of a coming out party for Blake Fisher. You're going against pretty good ends. Especially JT, who I think is a really good football player. Jack Sawyer's coming off, I think, the best game of his career, most disruptive game of his career, at least in my opinion. You've got to be able to win on the edge this year. They could not do it last year. And really lost every inside and outside battle against Ohio State last year. And you can say, well, they didn't have Jarrett Patterson, but I mean, it wouldn't have mattered. It wouldn't have mattered that much. Maybe they'd had 8 extra rushing yards, 9, 10 extra rushing yards. But you got whooped up front. You've got to handle it this year. And Blake Fisher, to me, if Blake comes out and says, okay, get on my back, ride me and Rocco, or you want to run the ball, coach, get behind me and Rocco. And if those 2 kids especially can play at a high level, man, that's going to be really impressive. Somebody asked me, I think it's an Ohio State fan, asked me, where are you getting Tyleik Williams' size from? The Ohio State roster. Maybe he's over 300 pounds, but Ohio State roster lists him at that weight. So that's where I'm getting it from, is Ohio State's roster, just so that we're clear. And so to me, back on track, but I think Blake Fisher to me is a guy that has to be on top of his game. He has to be come out and sort of have that coming out party that allows him to play at a high level. And if he can't, it just makes things tougher for Notre Dame. It does. It makes it tougher for them. And so he's going to have to play well. I mean, look, Notre Dame is an offensive line driven team. There's no doubt. Ohio State beat up Notre Dame's offensive line last year, and Notre Dame couldn't score. We broke this down. There was 5 or 6 plays where Notre Dame had receivers open. And when I mean open, I'm talking about open against a good team, not like 8 yards open, but like you've got 2-3 steps at least on a guy. Braden Lindsey had a couple of them. Lorenzo Styles had a couple of them. Matt Salerno had one where, man, if you had time to throw the football, you have a shot to have a big play there. And the quarterbacks either missed, or in most cases, they didn't have time to throw the football. The O-line is going to have to play at a high level, obviously, and it just can't be Joe Alt. He could play great, and the rest of the O-line gets their butts kicked, and Notre Dame's going to get their butt kicked. It's simple as that. They have to play well. And then the last one for me, yes, there's the receivers as a whole got to play well and all those type of things. You throw Audric Estime in there. To me, that's a star being a star. Audric has to be Audric. The 2 guys that I think that I believe have the biggest impact in this game is Tobias Merriweather and Chris Tyree. And the reason I say that is because you have to figure out a way to generate big plays against Ohio State. I don't think Notre Dame is even with they're much improved on offense, but I don't know that Ohio State's a team that you can just methodically go up and down the field on 12-play drives. It's impossible to consistently score against good teams when you're doing that. You have to figure out ways to generate big plays. And Notre Dame's going to have to be able to do that with their pass game, obviously. And the guys that give them the best chance to do that are Chris Tyree and Tobias Merriweather. We've seen them both do that the last 2 weeks. Chris Tyree had a 65-yard gain against NC State on a bit of a busted play. Tobias had a 45-yard gain against NC State. The two of those guys combined for, 5 catches for 179 yards last week. They both had a 75-plus yard touchdown last week. Tobias was 75. Chris was 76. They're going to have to be big play guys. They are. Notre Dame cannot afford to not get big plays in this game. They're going to have to get some big plays in this game. You look at what got Georgia in the game last year against Ohio State. They had a big pass play. They got him back in the game. Arian Smith with a 76-yard pass game to turn a 38-27 Ohio State lead into a 38-35 Ohio State lead, and Georgia ends up going down and winning the football game against them last year. So, you're going to need some of those big plays. You look at Georgia, he had a 52-yard run from Kenny McIntosh. You had the 76-yard gain from Arian Smith. You had a 35-yard gain from Keir Smith. You had a 28-yard gain from Marcus Rosemay Jackson. You had a 25-yard pass from Kenny Mitchell. You had a 22-yard gain from Adonai Mitchell. They're going to need plays like that. They're going to need some chunk plays in this game to be able to effectively move on Ohio State, because this is too good of a defense to just 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 play drives and consistently score enough points to win. You're not going to do that on Ohio State. Just like I don't think Ohio State's good enough to do that against Notre Dame. Most teams aren't. You need big plays. And so both teams are going to need that. And I believe Tobias Merriweather and Chris Tyree give Notre Dame the best chance to do that on offense. If they have big games, this offense could do really well against Ohio State. So that's going to be a big key for the offense. Let's go to the other side of the ball and look at the defense. Guys that need to step up. Again, we're going to start up front, guys. This is who I am. We're going to start in the trenches and work our way out. And for me, the two guys that need to play well are the two guys, to me, that have the most talent of the starters. I mean, I'm hoping Javonte Jean-Baptiste has a big game just because it's his former team. Expect Howard Cross to play well. Howard was Notre Dame's best defensive lineman last year against Ohio State. If you go back and watch that game, Howard had one of the best games of his career against Notre Dame against Ohio State last season. So, you hope he plays well. But when it comes down to it, if Notre Dame's going to handle their business in the way that they need to handle their business, it comes down to you need Riley Mills and Jordan Botelho to be on top of their game. You just do. Now, Riley's been good this year. He hasn't been great. He's been good this year. Jordan Botelho hasn't really been turned loose, in my opinion, so far this season. He's done some good things. He's been a pretty good run defender so far this year. That's going to have to continue in this football game, but they're going to need Jordan Botelho to provide more pass rush this season. Riley Mills so far in the year has 7 pressures. According to Pro Football Focus, he has 1 sack, 3 hits on the quarterback. Jordan Botelho only has 5. And you're talking about a guy that now he does have 7 run stops already, which is tied for 5th on the team, which is pretty good for a defensive lineman. But when you look at the bowl game last year, I mean, he's got 5 in 4 games. Jordan had 10 in last year's bowl game against South Carolina alone. Those two guys combined for 4 sacks last year, 3.5 sacks last year against South Carolina. They have to both play well. They have to. I have a hard time. Now, could Notre Dame win if they don't play well? Sure. If they can win in a shootout. I don't want to have to win in a shootout. That's going to be hard to win in a shootout because I'm always going to kind of go with the team that's got the big-time receivers, and Ohio State has the big-time receivers. To me, you need Riley Mills and Jordan Botelho to put pressure on the quarterback. You need them to come up with big stops, run game, big stops, pass game, big stops, get in Kyle McCord's face. Because I'm going to tell you right now, if Kyle McCord gets comfortable in this game, he will put up numbers. He will. He's a good quarterback. Is he C.J. Stroud? No, he's not C.J. Stroud, but a lot of guys aren't C.J. Stroud. But he's still a good quarterback. And if you give him time to throw to the best receiving core in the country with a really good tight end and backs that can do damage out of the backfield, that's another part of this, then you're going to be in trouble. The best way to keep him from going off, put pressure on him. Don't let him get comfortable in the pocket. That's going to be the key. And Notre Dame's going to need them. They're going to need those two players, to me, especially, to play well. Now, other guys got to play well too, but those guys have to have big games, in my opinion, if Notre Dame's going to come out there and handle their business the way that they need to handle their business. So it starts there. The next guy I want to talk about is Maris Leofau. And, Maris has been really good this year. And part of me wants to not jinx it and not talk about him. But at the end of the day, I don't really believe in that, but he's got to play well. He's been pretty good so far this year. I would argue Maris has been arguably their most disruptive defensive player this year. Jack Kaiser leads the team in stops according to Pro Football Focus. I'm going to have my next couple of days. I'll get my numbers updated for season-long numbers updated. I'm pretty sure Maris is going to have more stuffs because I go by stuffs, not stops. But Maris is second on the defense in stops, but he is tops on the defense in pressures this season. He has 8 pressures in 4 games at linebacker. He's also had a forced fumble. So he's played very disruptive football. You need him to be very disruptive in this game as well. He's also your most explosive linebacker. And there's going to be plays where Ohio State's going to try to run their stretch stuff and seal the outside. You're going to need him to get over the top, use his speed to get outside. He's going to have to be disruptive closing on the screen game. He's going to have to be disruptive closing on the crossing routes. They're going to try to run some wheel routes on him. They're going to try to get him, out of control. He's got to play disciplined, but he's got to play fast. That's going to be a big key. And if Maris can have a big game, that makes Notre Dame very hard to consistently move the ball on. Very hard. He has that kind of ability. And then the last one for me is Xavier Watts. I've talked about the stars need to be stars, right? So Cam, Benjamin, need y'all to step up and do your best against these receivers. Xavier Watts to me is important because he's going to be a guy that's going to be very instrumental in defending the tight end. He's going to be instrumental in defending the slot, whether it's Marvin Harrison and helping out with Thomas Harper, whether it's Julian Fleming, whether it's G. Scott in a 2 tight end look, whether it's Cade Stover running seams and overs and things like that. He's going to have a big role to play in coverage in this game and helping out. He's going to hope, I would imagine, be able to be providing a lot of the help when they have Marvin Harrison, either field side, either outside, or whether he's in the slot. And then, of course, he's going to have a big impact in the run game. Xavier's been very flashy this year, very flashy. He's had some plays you're like, whew, that's impressive. But then there's other plays where he'll still be out of position, take the wrong angle of the football, not wrap up, go for the big hit instead of wrapping up. He's got to play a really good game against Ohio State. If he does, then Notre Dame can have a really good run defender on all 3 levels of the defense. When you look at what they've got at linebacker, and then, of course, they have Xavier Watts. And he's a guy that has been, we talked about this in the offseason. Notre Dame needs more disruptions from their safeties. Last year, Notre Dame had 6 combined passes defensed last year. 6 from the safety position. That's not very good, obviously. And then but we said Maris or Xavier had half of them. He had 3 of their 6. He's already got 4 already this year. He's had 4 in 4 games. He's got 3 breakups and an interception. So he's a disruptive kid. They just need him to be consistently disruptive and limit some of the negatives that he's had so far this year. So Xavier and Marist on the 2nd and 3rd level have a chance to be difference makers for Notre Dame if they can play at their best. And that's what Notre Dame is going to need in this game, is you're going to need some guys to really play at their best. And if they can do that, then I think Notre Dame can win this football game. Not have a chance, not if everything goes your way, not if you play perfect, but to go out there and play their game. If they play their game at every spot, then I think Notre Dame is the better team, and they'll get their chance to do it. And if you don't play like that, then they'll have a shot to Ohio State will win the football game, and that's really what it comes down to. We're going to end this by getting to some super chats. We got 6 super chats I want to get to here before we get up out of here. Rob Osgood with a super chat. Rob says, thank you for the great news last night about Guerby Lambert. Can't wait for the game on Saturday. See y'all at the Duke game. I will be there. Thank you, Rob, for the super chat. And hopefully we're all in a good mood on Saturday night. We're going to have a late post-game show, everybody, but we're still going to have one. Win or lose, we're going to have one. Tristan Martz, IB Super Chat train sounds good for Ohio State week. I dig that. Appreciate that. DJ Holman, thank you, DJ, for the super chat. Appreciate you. Mistakenly watched an Ohio State show before this and need this for therapy afterwards. Go Irish. DJ, I'd love to know which one you watched, but there's some comedy, man, on some of that stuff. It's like, look, and I don't mind Ohio State fans and Ohio State analysts thinking they're going to win this game. They should think they're going to win this game. Notre Dame doesn't win big games like this. But just the lack of just respect, just knowledge of your opponent, just pure. I remember last year I was watching, somebody sent me a video that these 3 guys did before the Oregon game. And they were like, it's just like the condescending nature in which they're talking about Oregon. Like Oregon doesn't even belong except on the field, Ohio State, before that game. And, oh, they're going to win by 40 and they're going to blow them out. And Oregon doesn't have this, Oregon doesn't have that. And Oregon goes out there and just runs it all over them and beats Ohio State. They were the better team from start to finish against the Buckeyes. And it's grating because there's a way to cover your opponent that says, yeah, we're the better team and we're going to win this game, without coming across as just a total homer that knows nothing about your opponent and is just have utter contempt and disdain and condescension. And that's what I've kind of picked up on. It's just like, man, it's an interesting group for sure. Very interesting group. AST12321 with Super Chat. Thank you very much. Stoked to be at this game. My brother, who has never seen Notre Dame lose at home, is coming with me. He went to the crazy UCLA comeback, Stanford 2012, Clemson last year. I hope his luck holds. Yes. And I've also let the state police know that to be on the lookout for Ryan Roberts. I've given his photo to all authorities in the state of Indiana. If Ryan tries to cross the border and come into Indiana, he is not going to be allowed to because of what we talked about last week. Ryan hasn't been good luck. And then, of course, the worst game Notre Dame plays all year is a game that Ryan's at. I'm just saying. But in all seriousness, safe travels, and I hope your brother's luck continues. 365 to life. Thank you for Super Chat. Lambert's being discussed as being elite. Are there improvements he needs to make to his game, or just needs to demonstrate consistency to become a 5-star? Yeah, that's it for me, honestly. It's just offensive tackles. Like a guy to be a 5-star, you've got to just be like really dominant. And Guerby flashes that, but he's just not that every down, holy moly type of player right now. So just continue to get stronger in the weight room is going to be a key. Fill out that frame and just be more consistent with your technique. I will say this. I watched, there's actually a full game online that he played this year that you can go watch. And he played really, I mean, he showed a lot of that. I just need to see it. Like, to me, you don't watch one game and a guy plays like a 5-star in one game. It's not 5-star. No, I need to see him do it over the course of the season. But it's just about being a little bit more dominant at the point of attack in the run game, which is a technical thing for him because the tools are there. And then just seeing him be consistently more effective in pass pro. And I liked what I saw in the first. I saw highlights of the second game, and then I watched the whole first game. I liked what I saw so far from Guerby. And if he continues this throughout the season, then he'll have a shot to jump up to 5-star status. He's going to need some improvement. I don't hand out a lot of 5-stars. that's the thing for me. But at 28, if he stays at 28, he'll probably be a 5-star on all 3. So I could see that happening. But it's just consistency and then just a little bit more dominance. Gary L with a super chat. Thank you, Gary. Brian, can you discuss what Michigan has done to beat Ohio State over the last 2 years, offense and defense, and will Indy be able to utilize that recipe? Well, Gary, one thing that Michigan has done, that you have to look at the Michigan game, is they didn't just they didn't just kind of just take the game plan from 2021 and just say, hey, let's do this again. How they beat Michigan, how they beat Ohio State this year, or last year, I should say, was different than how they beat them the year before. Last year's game, to me, was not as start to finish dominant. Now, the final score was even more dominant than the year before. They won by 22. Michigan won by 22 last year. The year before, they won by 15. But I felt the 2021 game was the more just really like physically imposing, just dominant performance by Michigan, even though it didn't look as much like that. I felt when you go back and you look at the 2021 game, Michigan just came out and just imposed their will physically on Ohio State. The pass game was nothing more than just steady game manager, move the chains. CJ or Cade McNown hit a couple big throws in that game. He also had, I believe, 2 pass interference penalties down the field on Denzel Burke. They beat Denzel Burke for a big play that got him down to the 1, but it was mostly like, hey, take advantage, move the chains, manage the game. That type of thing is really what they did. They went 14 of 20 in that game, which is 70%. They were 9.5 per attempt. They only passed for 190 yards. They rushed for 297. They just ran on Michigan at will. Hassan Haskins went for 169 and 5 touchdowns. Blake Corum off the bench went for 87 on 6 touchdowns. AJ Henning scored on I think it was a reverse. I don't remember if it was a jet or reverse. You had your quarterbacks rush for 21 yards. Alvin Edwards had 1 carry for 8 yards. It was just a start to finish shellacking. Last year, I thought Ohio State early was out playing Michigan, and really, if it wasn't for big plays, I don't know that Ohio State doesn't have a 10 to 13 point lead at halftime if it's not for big plays. I mean, all Michigan could do in the first half was big plays because Ohio State was more geared towards stopping the run. They were a little bit more disciplined team in the run game. And Ohio State was able to have a 20-17 lead, and you just felt like, man, if they could just limit some of those big plays, I think they've got a shot to really win this football game, Ohio State. And then they come out in that game, and the second half of that game and the first drive of the second half, Michigan's just nickel dime, boom, 45-yard touchdown. And from that moment on, it was just kind of like Ohio State just didn't respond well to it at all. They traded punts, and then they come right back out. They're moving the ball down the field, and they punch one in the end zone and just, put this long drive together, and that broke Ohio State's spirit. I mean, that to me really broke their spirit. It was the one long drive they had, and so it was the big pass plays, and then that long drive that Michigan had. It was a 24-20 game in the third quarter. And let me see when Ohio State got the ball. I don't know if you guys remember this drive. Let me find here real quick. Ohio State got the ball. They started the drive with 5 minutes and 50 seconds left in the third quarter. They didn't score until the 13-10 mark of the fourth quarter. It was like an 8-minute drive, and they just went down and just ran it down Ohio State's throat. 15 plays, 81 yards, and it just Ohio State, I felt, quit. I just felt they quit, and then they kind of poured it on, and after that, Ohio State goes down and gets trade punts. Ohio State gets a field goal to make it 31-23, and then next play, boom, 75-yard touchdown run. Michigan gets the ball back. Third play, boom, 85-yard touchdown run. Game is over. So I didn't feel last year's game was as dominant as the year before. It was the big plays, and that's what Notre Dame's going to need to do. They're going to need to replicate a little bit of the combination of both to win this game, which is you need to be able to establish a run and get and be physical and all that. But the reality is, guys and gals, is this isn't that Ohio State team from 2021 anymore. Defensively, it's not. That staff is gone, and I believe the entire staff is gone. This is a brand new staff, different defense, different style defense, different philosophy, different personnel in a lot of instances. I don't know that you're just going to come out and just physically beat the crap out of them for 60 minutes. If they do, holy moly, that's going to say something about Notre Dame. I just don't think that's who this is. What allowed Michigan to win last year was they were able to be balanced, but then they hit those big plays. When Ohio State made a mistake, they took advantage. And there weren't a ton of them, but they took advantage. And then, of course, they broke Ohio State's will in the fourth quarter. That's what they're going to have to do in this game. Notre Dame is. You're going to have to establish a run a little bit more effectively than Ohio State did early last year. But you're going to have to create some big plays to pass game. You have to protect the quarterback. You're going to have to find some balance and then really wear them down in the fourth quarter. I mean, that's really the recipe for me. I don't think Notre Dame needs to say, hey, let's do what Michigan did. But the recipe of what Michigan did is it's going to be kind of a combination of both. I think Notre Dame is capable of that. They're going to have to play at a high level because this defense is going to be better than last year's defense, and this defense is going to be way better than the 2021 defense that Ohio State had. And so they're going to have to be able to do both of those things. But it's not just like, let's watch what Michigan did and do what they do. They're still a different type of team than Notre Dame in a lot of different ways. Carson Jackson with the super chat. Thank you, Carson. First super chat. Love the show. Best Notre Dame coverage in the business. Sam Hartman and this D-line taking advantage this week is the key. Now, look, the D-line is a big one, right? We all know Sam Hartman. But, Carson, first of all, thank you for the super chat. Appreciate that. And this is a heck of a week to get your first one in there. But the D-line one is big, right? It's big. Notre Dame's defensive line has to play well. They have to feast in this game. I don't know if they can. I don't know if they will. But they need to if Notre Dame's going to really handle their business in this game. There's no doubt. And, again, appreciate the super chat, my man. Last one, Quinn Kibler. Can't wait to see Ryan's tweets after we win. Yeah, Ryan and Vince especially are going to be not fun follows if you're an Ohio State fan, if Notre Dame wins. But of course, there's a lot of Ohio State people are going to be really unfun follows if they win this game too. That's the deal. You've got to go out there and handle your business. All the talk, we're not completely done with talk. We got a show tomorrow. We'll make our predictions tomorrow, and we'll talk about keys to victory and all that. And then we'll have our mailbag on Friday. But, between the two teams, the talk is over. It's time to go out and get it done. And Notre Dame's going to have to show themselves to be a team that's like be able to win the trench. I mean, guys, like you go back to Florida State 93 and you go back to 88 against Miami, 90 against Miami. And Notre Dame had some great athletes back then, right? I mean, the 88 team, you talk about Rocket Ismail, and you talk about Ricky Waters, and you talk about Derek Brown, who was a big-time freshman, and defensively Todd Light, who was a first-round pick, and you talk about some of the Tony Rice was a big-time athlete. Stance Magala was a really fast guy. Pat Terrell was a second-round draft pick who played in the NFL. Like Notre Dame had Michael Stonebreaker was a really athletic linebacker. And then the 93, when you look at the Notre Dame team in 93, I mean, Lee Becton was a big-time player. Ray Zellers, who was a high draft pick. Mark Edwards, who was an NFL player. You didn't quite have the dynamic speed that you had in 88 at receiver. Mike Miller could run, but Lake Dawson was an NFL guy. Derek Mays was a really good football player that year. Clint Johnson was a guy that was a big play threat. I mean, you had athletes, right? But they didn't have the athletes that Florida State had. They didn't have the athletes that Miami had. What allowed them to win those games was they were pretty good outside, even if they weren't quite as athletic as those other teams, but they could kick your butt in the trenches. Right? We have athletes, but we're going to beat Florida State because Bryant Young and Jim Flanagan and Brian Hamilton and all those guys go off. We're going to beat them in 1988 because Andre Williams has a huge pass rush that keeps Steve Walsh from stepping in that throw, because Chris Zorich played like a man possessed, because Andre Jones was making plays off the edge. Frank Stams is the first guy to sack Steve Walsh all year, forces a fumble, right? It was you dominating the trenches. That's got to be that's the recipe for Notre Dame to be a great football team. You've got to dominate in the trenches against the best teams. And that's what Marcus Freeman has said he wants to establish. And if they're going to win this football game, yes, the athletes got to make plays. They have to make plays. But you've got to be the better team in the trenches. That's it. And if they do that, they can win this football game. If they don't, it's going to be a lot harder. Because if this just comes down to athlete versus athlete, I don't know that Notre Dame can win that, just athlete on athlete. They can be more competitive than people think. It's like we've been doing this for years, guys, right? Like every time we go play Georgia and you go play, I remember talking to Georgia people, and Georgia fans were great, by the way. I mean, they were respectful. When they talk trash, it was all in fun. But they were just like, look, you guys just don't have enough speed to play with us. And both times, 17 and 19, especially 17, especially 19. Like, dude, you guys are a lot more athletic than we realized. Like, man, your D-line was eating us up. That Claypool guy's a monster. We couldn't cover your tight end. Man, your corners can really run. Those were the things that people would say. That they were surprised at how athletic Notre Dame was in those matchups. And Notre Dame's always, for the last few years, for the most part, there's been a couple, here and there. 20, they weren't a great athletic team. 21, at spots they were, at other spots they weren't. But last year's team was athletic. The athleticism and speed wasn't Notre Dame's problem last year. They had a lot of other problems. This is not a team that lacks athleticism. But do they have a Marvin Harrison, a receiver? No, they don't. That's just the reality of it. Audric Estime is a heck of a running back. I think he's right now the best running back that's going to be on the field on Saturday. Does he have the explosiveness of Travion Henderson? No, he doesn't. But they're athletic. They are. They have speed. But they're just not going to win because of that if they're not winning in the trenches. That's where the advantage has to be. And that's why they have to play well. And so, you go back to, to Carson's super chat, the D line has to be that group, but the O line has to play like it too. This is a make your money game for Joe Rudolph. It absolutely is. This is the kind of game that Joe Alt can look at and say, hey, why was Joe Alt a top 5 pick? Go look what he did against JT and Jack Sawyer. That's what it comes down to. Same thing for Blake Fisher. Hey, why is Blake Fisher getting NFL love? Dude, did you see what he did against Ohio State? It has to be that kind of game for those guys. If they do that, then I think this is the better team. If Notre Dame plays their game, Ohio State plays their game, I think Notre Dame's a better team. I do. And we'll find out on Saturday if I'm right or if I'm wrong. And then we can figure out what comes next either way. So that's going to do it for today's show, everybody. I appreciate y'all so very much. Tonight, IB Nation Sports Talk, 6 o'clock. Tomorrow, we'll be back. We'll go live at 1 o'clock. Ryan and I will go live at 1. we will do our keys to victory and our prediction show. We'll make our score predictions for that. And then Friday, 1 o'clock, we'll have our mailbag before Saturday night, 7:30. Notre Dame starts against Ohio State. It's going to be a fun one. We will be tailgating also for those of you who have asked. Just a reminder, we will be tailgating on Saturday. Follow me on Twitter. I'll also put on the message board when we actually finally park. We will get all set up, and I'll let you guys know where we are. My mom's catering the whole thing. We're gonna have a lot of fun. It's gonna be a blast. It's gonna be a blast. I don't know for sure when we're gonna start, but like I said, I hope to get started around 1, 2 at the latest is when we plan on getting started. I'll be there. Vince will be there for a time. Angela will be there. My parents will be there, and then of course we'll get into the game. So if you are going to be in town, or whether you're going to the game or you just want to tailgate, we'll be in the stadium lot. I'm not sure where. We'll be in the stadium lot. I'll tweet it out, put it on the board and all that kind of stuff. So you guys will be able to check it out. Last minute super chat from Mike Lane. Thank you, Mike. Everyday listener, longtime board member. Can't make a lot of the live chats. Just wanted to say thanks. Go Irish and bust some on this Saturday. Couldn't read that one, Mike. I don't want to get demonetized, but hopefully they do. They're able to do that. My mom's got like names for all the foods and stuff. It's going to be a blast. So I hope to see you all there on Saturday for the IB tailgate. Have a great rest of your day, everybody. We'll talk to you again soon on the Irish Breakdown Podcast.